The year is 1967. Across the sun-scorched sands of the Middle East, tension hums like a distant storm. The echoes of old wars still linger. 1948, 1956 memories of victory, humiliation, and unfinished revenge. In Cairo, crowds chant beneath banners of Arab pride. In Tel Aviv, soldiers clean their rifles in uneasy silence. Every border feels thin, every rumor feels real, and every heart beats to the rhythm of an approaching war. Gamal Abdel Nasser, the voice of a new Arab dawn, dreams of unity and power. Israel young, defiant, and surrounded dreams only of survival, and between them lies a region ready to ignite. What follows will last only 6 days. But in that brief moment, entire nations will rise and fall. Borders will vanish, and the world will awaken to a new Middle East. This is the story of the Third Arab-Israeli War, a war of speed and shock, faith and fury, triumph and loss. You're listening to Lullaby of Empires, where history speaks softly and the past breathes again. Chapter 1. The Gathering Storm. The story of 1967 does not begin with gunfire. It begins with silence, a silence that stretched across deserts and borders, a silence so heavy that even the wind seemed to wait. Beneath that silence, tension brewed like heat beneath the sand. For nearly 2 decades, the Middle East had lived in the shadow of unfinished wars. The conflict of 1948 had drawn lines not only across maps but across generations, and the Suez Crisis of 1956 had shown the world that those lines were written in dust, easily shifted, easily broken. By the mid-1960s, the Middle East was a cauldron simmering on low flame. Armies rebuilt, leaders made speeches of defiance and destiny. The region's wounds never truly healed, they simply hardened into scars. In Cairo, President Gamal Abdel Nasser stood at the heart of this transformation, proud, charismatic, and determined to restore Arab honor. He spoke of unity, of a single Arab nation, stretching from the Atlantic to the Gulf, one that would stand against imperialism and reclaim dignity lost to foreign hands. To millions across the Arab world, he was not just a politician, he was a symbol of awakening. But to Israel, his rise was a shadow stretching long and dark across their fragile security. In those years, Israel was still a young nation, barely 19 years old. It had survived its birth through war, carved from conflict, and held together by willpower. But it was surrounded on every side by enemies who had never accepted its existence. Every morning, the residents of border towns awoke to the sound of artillery from Syrian hills or the threat of raids from neighboring lands. Every night, families listened to the distant rumble of engines and wondered if war would return by dawn. Israel's army drilled endlessly, its pilots trained tirelessly, and its leaders planned for a war they hoped would never come but expected every day. To understand the storm of 1967, one must first see the shifting sands of power beneath it. The Arab world, still recovering from colonial manipulation and foreign control, found in Nasser a voice of defiance. Egypt's nationalization of the Suez Canal in 1956 had humiliated Britain and France and elevated Nasser into a hero across the Arab world. But victory brought expectation. He had promised not just independence, he had promised triumph. And triumph required an enemy. That enemy, in the eyes of many, was Israel, the small state that had defeated Arab armies in 1948 and again stood unbroken after the Suez conflict. Its very existence was seen as a wound to Arab pride. For the men who listened to Nasser's fiery speeches in Cairo and Damascus, it was not enough that Israel existed. It had to be erased, for only then could dignity return. Through the early 1960s, the borders crackled with violence. On the Syrian front, artillery rained down from the Golan Heights onto the farmlands below. Israeli farmers in the Hula Valley worked their fields under constant threat of sniper fire. Each retaliation by Israeli jets was met with outrage from Arab capitals. The pattern was deadly and familiar: fire, revenge, escalation. Yet beneath it all lay something deeper, a growing sense that another great war was inevitable. In May 1967, that sense became reality. It began with a whisper, a report from Moscow to Cairo, claiming that Israel was massing divisions near the Syrian border. The intelligence was false, but in a region fueled by fear and pride, truth mattered little. Nasser saw opportunity in the warning. To his people, he could appear as the protector of Syria, the champion of the Arab cause. To the world, he could prove that Egypt would no longer bow to Western caution. Within days, Egyptian tanks rolled eastward into the Sinai Peninsula, a sea of sand stretching from the Nile to the borders of Israel. The desert thundered with engines. Columns of armored vehicles painted long shadows over the dunes. Soldiers sang songs of victory as they marched, their voices carried by the wind. For the Arab world, it was a moment of pride, reborn, the image of Egyptian power rising once again. But in Tel Aviv, the news landed like a cold blade. The Israeli cabinet gathered in tense silence. Maps spread across tables. Generals debated. Could Egypt be bluffing, or was this the prelude to annihilation? Then came the next blow, one that made war almost certain. On May 16, Nasser demanded that the United Nations peacekeeping force, stationed in Sinai since the 1956 war, withdraw immediately. The UN complied, leaving a void where once there had been fragile balance. The same day, Egyptian troops moved into the now empty posts. On May 22, Nasser made his most fateful decision. He closed the Straits of Tiran, cutting off Israel's access to the Red Sea and its vital shipping routes. To the rest of the world, it was a political gesture, but to Israel it was a chokehold, an act of war. Inside Israel, the mood turned electric, streets filled with nervous energy. Men checked their call-up papers, women stocked pantries and prepared shelters. The memories of 1948, the siege, the hunger, the desperation, were still fresh. The army mobilized. Fighter jets were lined in neat rows on desert runways, camouflaged beneath nets. The nation waited for a strike that could come from any direction. But behind the anxiety, there was also resolve, a quiet, unspoken belief that Israel could not simply wait to be struck again. Its survival had always depended on action, not reaction. The country's prime minister, Levi Eshkol, faced enormous pressure. His cabinet fractured between caution and confrontation. The generals urged him to strike first, to seize the initiative before the combined Arab armies surrounded them. The world, however, urged restraint. Washington warned against preemption. The United Nations called for calm. And yet, the calm had already died. Meanwhile, Nasser's confidence soared. Crowds in Cairo filled the streets, chanting his name. From balconies, radios broadcast his speeches to the world, words burning with defiance. If war comes, he declared, it will be total, and the objective will be the destruction of Israel. Across the Arab world, his words ignited fire. Jordan, led by King Hussein, signed a defense pact with Egypt. Iraq sent expeditionary forces westward. Syria increased shelling from the north. The borders of Israel became a tightening ring of steel. And yet, in those final days of May, as soldiers prepared and leaders plotted, a strange quiet settled once again. The calm before the storm returned, heavier now, more suffocating. Diplomats scrambled for peace that no one truly believed in. The world's newspapers printed maps of the region, with headlines predicting war. The only uncertainty was when. In Tel Aviv, the Israeli Air Force trained relentlessly under the guise of routine exercises. Pilots memorized every airfield in Egypt, their runways, their defenses, their flight patterns. Intelligence officers studied photographs taken from high altitude, tracing routes that would later become legends. The operation had a name whispered in secrecy: Moked Focus. Its goal was clear: strike first, strike fast, and blind the enemy. Yet even as these plans took shape, the weight of decision pressed hard on Israel's leaders. A preemptive strike might save the nation, or damn it in the eyes of the world. Every hour they hesitated, the ring of enemies grew tighter. Eshkol, torn between international caution and national survival, finally yielded to the voice of his generals. On June 1, Israel formed a national unity government, bringing the fiery Moshe Dayan into the role of Minister of Defense. Dayan was decisive, daring, and unafraid to gamble. Within days, he would make a decision that would change the course of the Middle East. The stage was set. On the surface, the desert slept beneath its shimmering heat. But beneath that calm, an entire region trembled with anticipation. Armies stood ready on every border, Egypt to the south, Jordan to the east, Syria to the north. Tanks glistened in the sunlight, aircraft engines purred in hidden hangars, and soldiers whispered prayers into the sand. In that uneasy stillness, history paused one last breath before the roar. For those who lived through it, those last nights of peace felt longer than any battle. Mothers tucked their children in with trembling hands. Soldiers cleaned their weapons and stared into the darkness. And across the region, from Cairo to Jerusalem, from Amman to Damascus, the same thought burned in every heart: the war is coming, and when it does, the world will never look the same. Chapter 2. Nasser's Dream. The story of the Six-Day War cannot be told without the story of one man, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the soldier who became a symbol, the leader who carried the weight of millions, and the dreamer who believed he could reshape the Arab world. He was born in Alexandria, in a time when Egypt was still under the shadow of foreign control, a land ruled by kings but owned by empires. Nasser grew up in a country where the Nile carried not just water, but humiliation. British officers marched through Cairo's streets with authority, and Egyptian soldiers saluted flags that were not their own. From this humiliation, a fire was born, the fire of nationalism. As a young man, Nasser joined the Free Officers Movement, a group of restless soldiers who believed that Egypt's destiny was its own. In 1952, they toppled the monarchy, and for the first time in centuries, Egypt belonged to Egyptians. But revolutions are rarely peaceful. In the chaos that followed, Nasser emerged quiet, determined, and unyielding. He was not a man of many smiles, but of purpose. His voice, calm yet commanding, carried through the radios of Cairo like a promise, and that promise was simple: dignity. For Nasser, dignity was not just a word, it was a mission. He spoke of unity, of throwing off the last remnants of colonialism, of building an Arab world that would stand proud and strong. To him, the Arabs were not a collection of nations divided by lines on a map. They were one people, bound by culture, language, and destiny. And under his leadership, that destiny would awaken. By the mid-1952s, Nasser's Egypt had become the beating heart of this new movement. His speeches drew millions into the streets. Farmers, workers, soldiers, all cheering a man who dared to speak against the powers that once ruled them. He nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, taking back what Britain and France had built but never truly owned. The world gasped. The West fumed. Britain, France, and Israel launched a secret attack to take it back. But through a strange twist of global politics, it was not Nasser who fell, but the old empires themselves. The Suez Crisis ended with British and French withdrawal, under pressure from both the United States and the Soviet Union. Nasser had survived. No more than survived, he had triumphed. The image of him standing defiant, his arm raised in salute, as Western forces withdrew, became legend. Overnight, Nasser was no longer just Egypt's president. He was the voice of the Arab world. From Morocco to Iraq, his words carried like wind over sand. We will build a future where Arabs decide their own fate. And for a time, it seemed possible. But dreams are fragile things, and Nasser's dream was vast. Too vast for the borders of any single nation. His call for pan-Arab unity stirred pride, but also fear. Kings and presidents across the Middle East, many ruling fragile monarchies, worried that Nasser's revolution would ignite their own people, yet even those who distrusted him could not ignore him. For the Arab street, the young, the poor, the proud, Nasser was hope itself. To the west, however, his dream looked dangerous. Egypt's growing ties with the Soviet Union alarmed Washington and London. Nasser played both sides, accepting weapons from Moscow, but maintaining a tone of independence. He was no puppet. His Egypt was modernizing, building dams, factories, schools, but every success came with new pressure. His enemies whispered that he was spreading himself too thin. His allies demanded more than he could give. And then, there was Israel, small, defiant, and unyielding, a constant reminder of the Arab world's division and defeat. Nasser spoke often of destroying it, but his words were as much political as military, a way to unite Arab pride under one banner. Yet each speech lit sparks that others were eager to turn into fire. In Damascus, Syria's new radical leaders heard Nasser's words not as rhetoric but as command. Their artillery shelled Israeli villages from the Golan Heights. Their newspapers called for war. By 1966, relations between Egypt and Syria had grown closer. Both nations signed a defense pact, promising to stand together if Israel attacked either. It was a gesture of solidarity, and a dangerous one. Syria's provocations often drew Israeli retaliation, and every time it did, Egypt was bound to respond. What had once been a symbolic alliance became a trap, pulling Nasser closer to a war he didn't truly want. He knew the odds. He knew his army was large but poorly coordinated, his air force proud but vulnerable, his officers loyal but inexperienced. He knew that Israel, though smaller, was fast, organized, and fierce. But the weight of his image, the myth of Nasser, left him no room for caution. A hero cannot show fear, even when the ground beneath him begins to tremble. In May 1967, when the Soviets told him that Israeli divisions were massing on the Syrian border, he faced a choice: ignore the warning and risk looking weak, or act and risk war. He chose action. Tanks rolled eastward across the Sinai. Soldiers raised Egyptian flags on dunes that shimmered like gold beneath the rising Sunday radios. Across Cairo roared with pride. For many Egyptians, it felt as if Nasser's promise, Arab unity, Arab power, was finally coming to life. But behind the scenes, he hesitated. He didn't want war, not yet. What he wanted was deterrence to show Israel and the world that Egypt was strong enough to stand its ground. Yet in the delicate balance of power, perception often matters more than intention. His actions were read not as defense, but as declaration. When he ordered the UN peacekeepers out of Sinai, the symbolism was unmistakable. Egypt was reclaiming its sovereignty, but to Israel, it looked like the first move of invasion. Then came the closure of the Straits of Tiran, a decision that would tip the world into war. Nasser likely saw it as a gesture, a show of strength, but for Israel, it was existential. The tiny port of Eilat was its gateway to the Red Sea, to trade routes beyond hostile neighbors. To close it was to choke the nation's lifeline. As the days passed, the Arab world rallied around him. Crowds chanted his name in Baghdad, Amman, and Damascus. Radio Cairo declared, "We are ready for war. We are ready to end the occupation. We are ready to liberate Palestine." Across the region, the dream of Nasser's unity reached its peak. It was intoxicating and irreversible. In private, though, Nasser was uneasy. He confided to close aides that Egypt was not prepared for a prolonged conflict. His army was large, yes, over 200,000 strong, but its command structure was brittle. Many of his officers were more loyal to him politically than militarily. His air force, though proud, was outdated compared to Israel's fast, modern fleet. But by then, pride had taken command. To step back would mean humiliation. To advance might mean ruin. As he gazed over the Nile from his office in Cairo, Nasser faced a cruel paradox. He had become a prisoner of his own legend. The people who had raised him up as a hero would never forgive him for backing down. The same charisma that had built his power now trapped him within it. On the night of June 4th, 1967, the streets of Cairo glowed with anticipation. Soldiers sang in cafes, their rifles stacked by the door. Banners of unity fluttered in the warm night wind. In radio studios, announcers spoke of the coming dawn when Arab armies would march to victory. But far to the east, in air bases hidden among Israel's deserts, another dawn was already waiting, one that would break not in triumph, but in fire. For Nasser, the dream of unity was still alive that night. But in less than 24 hours, it would begin to crumble, grain by grain, beneath the roar of engines and the glare of the morning sunday. And as history would soon show, the higher the dream, the harder the fall. Chapter 3. Encircled Nation. In the weeks before June 1967, Israel was a nation that barely slept. The hum of radios filled every home, every cafe, every military outpost. Newspapers ran the same words in bold across their front pages: "The crisis deepens." And though the headlines changed daily, the feeling beneath them remained the same. Something irreversible was coming. The country was small, smaller than many of its enemies' provinces. It stretched only a few hours' drive from north to south, its borders surrounded by nations that did not recognize its right to exist. In those tense days, the fear of annihilation hung in the air like dust. Yet beneath that fear, another current ran strong: the stubborn will to survive. For Israelis who had lived through 1948, war was not a concept, it was memory. Many of the soldiers now cleaning their rifles had once fought as teenagers in that first desperate war of independence. They remembered the sieges, the narrow escapes, the rationed food. They remembered how close their country had come to being crushed before it had even begun. Now, 19 years later, the same faces, older, scarred, wiser, stood ready again, but this time the stakes felt even higher. To them, survival was not about territory or pride. It was about existence itself. In the days after Nasser's forces moved into Sinai and the Straits of Tiran were closed, Israel felt its circle of isolation tightening. From the north, Syrian guns looked down from the cliffs of the Golan Heights, their barrels aimed at farms in the valleys below. From the east, Jordan's army stood ready across the River Jordan, reinforced by Iraqi divisions. To the south, Egypt's legions now filled the desert with engines and dust. From the sky to the sea, Israel was trapped in a ring of fire. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol faced a crisis that no words could soften. His government was divided between caution and courage, between fear of diplomatic backlash and the instinct to strike first. The Americans urged restraint. President Lyndon B. Johnson warned that Israel should not fire the first shot, that world opinion could turn overnight if they appeared as aggressors. But Eshkol knew his people. He knew the geography. He knew that if Israel waited to be struck, it might not survive the first blow. Inside the Israeli Defense Forces headquarters, generals gathered in rooms heavy with cigarette smoke and maps. Yitzhak Rabin, the chief of staff, spoke plainly. "If we do not act soon, they will crush us." He had spent sleepless nights studying troop movements, watching the buildup on every border. He saw the numbers: 240,000 Arab troops arrayed against 100,000 Israelis, 957 Arab aircraft against 300 Israeli jets. On paper, it was impossible. Yet Israel had something those numbers couldn't measure: discipline, preparation, and desperation. Still, fear spread through the country like fever. Gas masks were distributed in cities, trenches were dug in schoolyards, hospitals rehearsed emergency plans. Families in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem filled bathtubs with water, stocked food, and whispered prayers, as if the past were returning. In kibbutzim near the borders, men and women buried precious documents and photographs in the ground just in case they never came back. But even in those fearful days, there was something remarkable about Israel's unity. People volunteered without being asked. Young men who had left the country for work or study returned home overnight. Women organized blood drives, packed field kits, and cooked for entire platoons. The whole nation moved with a single heartbeat, caught between dread and defiance. Eshkol, though cautious by nature, felt the walls closing in. He knew time was running out, both politically and militarily. The public wanted action, and the generals demanded it. On May 28, he addressed the nation on live radio. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke, betraying exhaustion and the crushing weight of leadership. Some criticized him for it. They mistook his hesitation for weakness. But behind those words was a man who understood too well the cost of war. That broadcast would change everything. In the days that followed, Israel's political factions, usually divided by ideology, came together under one purpose. The old rivalries melted away as the threat grew clearer. On June 1, Israel formed a national unity government, inviting opposition figures into leadership. And in that moment of crisis, one name returned to power: Moshe Dayan. Dayan, the one-eyed general with the black patch, was a legend. To the public, he embodied courage and boldness. To the army, he was the man who understood the rhythm of battle. His appointment as Minister of Defense lifted morale like a sunrise after endless dusk. Newspapers carried his picture on their front pages. Children whispered his name like a spell of safety. For the soldiers waiting in the desert, his return meant one thing: that when the time came, Israel would strike. And yet, even as Dayan began shaping strategy, he moved carefully, aware that the wrong decision could doom the nation. Intelligence reports poured in: daily troop numbers, positions, airfield coordinates, fuel reserves. The Israeli Air Force, under General Mordechai Hod, rehearsed its maneuvers in silence. Every pilot knew his target by heart. Every flight plan was memorized. The entire operation was rehearsed under the guise of routine training. The plan had a name: Operation Moked, Operation Focus. Its goal was as daring as it was desperate: to destroy the Egyptian Air Force before its planes could even leave the ground. Israel's best pilots would fly at ultra-low altitudes, below enemy radar, strike 14 airfields in less than 3 hours, and return before the world could react. It was the kind of gamble that could only work once in history. While preparations continued, ordinary life tried to go on, but it did so in slow motion, like a city living underwater. Streets were quieter, prayers longer, laughter rarer. The fear of annihilation had become a kind of silence that people learned to live inside. Still, in that silence, there was resolve. As one soldier later recalled, "We were afraid, yes, but we had nowhere else to go." On the night of June 4, the final decision was made. In a small, dimly lit room in Tel Aviv, the cabinet met for hours. The atmosphere was heavy, yet calm, the calm of people who had already crossed the line in their minds. The vote was nearly unanimous. Israel would strike first. The next morning, at dawn, the war would begin. That night, the soldiers slept little. Pilots lay beside their aircraft, staring at the stars above the desert sky. Some wrote letters they never intended to send. Others prayed. They were young, many in their 20s, yet they carried the weight of a nation. Across the border, the Egyptian camps were still awake. Radios hummed, orders shifted, but few expected an attack. After all, Israel's media had published stories that its soldiers were on vacation, its pilots in routine drills. The deception had worked perfectly. As the hours slipped toward dawn, the air itself seemed to change. The tension that had hung over the land for weeks reached its breaking point. In the homes of Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Haifa, families waited beside radios in the dark. In Cairo, Nasser stood firm, convinced that Israel would not dare to strike first. In Washington and Moscow, diplomats watched and worried, unaware that by the time they finished their morning briefings, history would have already changed. And so, on that final night, before the world awakened to fire and thunder, Israel, small, surrounded, and uncertain, stood alone but unbroken. A nation of 2.5 million souls, facing armies 10 times its size, holding its breath before the leap. The sky above was still dark, but beneath it, engines were already warming. Chapter 4. Operation Focus. The night before the war, Israel did not sleep. Across the country, lights glowed softly in windows. Radios whispered the latest updates, their voices low, uncertain, and measured. In the desert, soldiers cleaned their rifles in silence, the smell of oil and sand heavy in the air. And at air bases scattered across the Negev and the coastal plains, the heart of the Israeli Air Force pulsed quietly in the dark. 200 aircraft stood ready: Mirage, Sikarais, Super Mystères, Vautours, sleek machines of steel and flame. Their wings gleamed faintly under the moonlight. Beside them, young pilots walked slowly, almost reverently, running their hands across the fuselage as if to steady both themselves and the machines they would fly. At precisely 3 a.m., the order came through. Prepare for takeoff. No speeches, no fanfare. Just quiet nods and the distant rumble of engines coming alive. For years they had trained for this moment, Operation Moked, or Focus. It was the single most daring plan in the modern history of aerial warfare. Israel's survival depended on it. The goal was simple in words, impossible in practice: to destroy the Egyptian Air Force before it could ever leave the ground. To do that, Israel would have to send nearly all its planes, almost its entire air fleet, across enemy lines. If they failed, the skies above Israel would be empty, and the country would be left defenseless. But if they succeeded, they would own the sky. General Mordecai Hod, commander of the Air Force, had spent months shaping the plan. Every detail was considered: fuel loads, flight altitudes, radio silence, the timing of sunrise. Even the smallest error could unravel it all. The pilots had rehearsed every maneuver, memorized every runway, every anti-aircraft battery, but there was one more layer to their strategy deception. In the weeks before the operation, Israel's newspapers had run stories that its pilots were on leave, that they were relaxing by the sea. In truth, they were training harder than ever. Their flight paths were disguised as routine drills. Their takeoff times matched daily schedules. To anyone watching, it looked ordinary, almost peaceful. And to make sure no one outside knew what was coming, Israeli intelligence had even damaged the tracking antenna of the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv, ensuring that no signals could warn Washington before the operation began. At 7:10 a.m., as dawn broke over the desert, the pilots gathered for a final briefing. No notes, no charts. They had long since memorized everything. One by one, they looked at their commanding officers, nodded, and walked toward their planes. The sun was just beginning to rise, turning the horizon gold and blood red. The engines roared to life, and the earth began to tremble. The first wave, nearly 200 fighter jets, lifted off, one after another, vanishing low over the sands. They flew just a few meters above ground, skimming so low that radar couldn't catch them. For half an hour, they flew in eerie silence, cutting through the morning haze. Their radios remained off. The world had no idea they were in the air. At 7:45 a.m., the first explosions lit the Egyptian sky. The planes descended on 14 Egyptian airfields almost simultaneously: El Arish, Abu Suwair, Inshas, Fayed, Cairo West. They came from the sun, blinding the defenders below. Within seconds, hangars erupted in flame. The sound was deafening. The tearing roar of engines, the thunder of bombs, the crack of shrapnel raining over concrete. Egyptian aircraft, MiGs, Il-28 bombers, and Su-7 seconds burned where they stood. Pilots raced to their planes, only to find them destroyed. Fuel depots ignited, sending columns of black smoke spiraling into the air. The first wave lasted just 80 minutes, and when it was over, 189 Egyptian aircraft were gone. The second wave came immediately after. Israeli jets returned to refuel and rearm in record time, 7 minutes on the ground, no more. Mechanics worked like dancers, moving with precision and speed. Within minutes, the planes were airborne again, striking new targets: airfields, deeper inside Egypt, communication hubs, command centers. By 10 a.m., 338 Egyptian aircraft had been destroyed. Over 100 pilots were dead. Egypt's Air Force, once the pride of the Arab world, was gone. In the control rooms of Cairo, confusion turned to disbelief. Reports came in from every base, all under attack, all burning. President Nasser at first refused to believe it. "It's impossible," he said. "It must be exaggerated." But, as the smoke rose over Cairo West and Fayed, the truth became undeniable. The Egyptian Air Force no longer existed. At the same time, Jordanian and Syrian radar stations detected what they thought were Israeli losses. They radioed Cairo, congratulating them on a supposed victory. The false reports spread quickly, a cruel irony, as the real disaster unfolded before them. By the time the truth reached them, it was already too late. At 11 a.m., Jordanian and Syrian planes launched their own retaliatory attacks on Israeli positions. They bombed West Jerusalem, Netanya, and air bases near Ramat David. Civilians ran for cover. 20 Israelis were killed. But within hours, Israel's counterstrike began the same precision, the same ferocity. Israeli jets swept over Amman and Damascus, striking the airfields that had launched the attacks. The results were devastating. In a matter of hours, 28 Jordanian, 53 Syrian, and 10 Iraqi planes were destroyed. The skies of the Middle East fell silent, and in that silence, Israel had already won the air war. From that moment on, the ground battles that would follow in the Sinai, in Jerusalem, in the Golan Heights, would unfold beneath skies ruled entirely by Israeli wings. The success was absolute, but the human side of it was still heavy. Many Israeli pilots returned to base, shaken, not jubilant. They had seen the pressure, enemy's devastation up close, runways littered with burning wreckage, soldiers running helplessly amid fire. For all its precision, the war had a face, and that face was loss. But strategically, it was nothing short of miraculous. In less than 4 hours, Israel had shifted the balance of power in the Middle East. Back in Tel Aviv, the Israeli High Command received the news in fragments-coded transmissions, short reports. Then, finally, the message that would become legend: the Egyptian Air Force is finished. Prime Minister Eshkol exhaled for the first time in days. For weeks, he had been haunted by the fear of annihilation. Now, hope returned, fragile, bright, and terrifying in its own way. For the rest of the world, however, confusion reigned. Western correspondents in Cairo reported explosions, but no clear outcome. Rumors spread that Israel had suffered heavy losses. Only by nightfall did the scale of the event begin to emerge. Diplomats from Moscow and Washington listened in stunned silence as reports confirmed that Israel had, in a single morning, achieved total air supremacy. In Cairo, Nasser sat in a darkened room, surrounded by ministers. His face, usually firm and confident, was drawn. "The war has begun," he said quietly, "and we have lost the air." Around him, the room was silent, the sound of defeat arriving not in shouts, but in the quiet collapse of certainty. Meanwhile, across the desert, Egyptian columns were still advancing, unaware that the skies above them no longer belonged to them. The soldiers on the ground looked up and saw the contrails of Israeli jets, thin, silver lines against the blue, and understood too late what it meant. For the Israeli pilots who returned that evening, exhaustion mingled with disbelief. Some slept on the ground beside their planes, too tired to remove their helmets. Others simply stared into the horizon, where the sun was setting over the Sinai, its light fading through smoke and dust. They had done what seemed impossible, but they knew that what came next would be far harder, because the war was not over. It had only begun. The ground assault on the Sinai was already underway, and Jerusalem, the city of stone and silence, would soon become a battlefield once more. But for now, as the night returned over the desert, the engines cooled, and the world held its breath. The sky was quiet, utterly, eerily quiet, for the first time that day. And beneath it, history changed forever. Chapter 5. The Skies Fall Silent. The roar of battle faded as the sun dipped toward the horizon. What began in fire and fury ended in silence, the kind of silence that follows when the unthinkable has already happened. Across the sands of the Sinai Peninsula, columns of black smoke curled into the evening air. The smell of burning fuel, scorched metal, and dust carried for miles. Egyptian soldiers stared upward in disbelief. The sky that had once been theirs now belonged entirely to someone else. The mighty Egyptian Air Force, once paraded as the pride of the Arab world, was gone, wiped out in hours. At first, no one believed it. Egyptian commanders radioed their bases for status reports, but the lines were dead. Entire airfields had gone silent, their control towers reduced to rubble. MiG-21 seconds and bombers lay twisted on the tarmac, melted by the heat of their own ammunition. For the soldiers on the ground, the war they had trained for was already lost before it began. President Gamal Abdel Nasser, sitting in his office in Cairo, waited for news that never came. Reports arrived in fragments, words half lost in static. Cairo West destroyed. Fayed burning. Inshas gone. At first, he thought it was disinformation. It had to be. How could so much be lost in a single morning? His generals tried to reassure him, promising that reinforcements were already regrouping, but outside, the skies were empty. By nightfall, the truth became undeniable. Egypt's air force no longer existed. It wasn't just Egypt. By evening, the air forces of Jordan, Syria, and Iraq lay shattered too. Hundreds of planes destroyed on the ground before they could even lift off. In Damascus, the horizon glowed red. In Amman, smoke rose from air bases that had once guarded the skies of Jerusalem. The Arab coalition, united in purpose and rhetoric, had been silenced before it could take its first breath. The Six-Day War had been raging for less than 12 hours. In Israel, the reaction was a strange, trembling quiet. There were no celebrations, not yet. The streets of Tel Aviv were still half empty, the radio broadcasts still cautious. The people had lived too long with the expectation of catastrophe to believe in victory so easily. For weeks, they had dug shelters, prepared for the worst. And now, suddenly, the worst hadn't come. Inside the command bunker beneath the Kiryat Defense Headquarters, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol stood beside Moshe Dayan and Yitzhak Rabin, staring at a wall of maps dotted with tiny lights. Each light marked a destroyed enemy airfield. Dayan, never one for ceremony, simply nodded. "Now," he said, "we can fight on our terms." Rabin exhaled deeply, not in triumph, but in relief. "It's not over yet," he reminded him quietly. "It's only begun." Above them, the radio announcers' voices carried through every living room in Israel. The government still avoided details, not wanting to alert the world to how decisive the strike had been, but rumors spread fast. In cafes and markets, people whispered that the Egyptian planes were gone. Mothers cried in relief. Fathers clutched newspapers they didn't yet trust. For the first time in weeks, the sound of sirens was replaced by the sound of breath. But across the border, in the Arab world, the silence was different, heavier, darker. In Cairo, confusion gave way to anger. Officers rushed from one building to another, shouting contradictory orders. On state radio, broadcasters told listeners that Egypt had repelled Israeli attacks and that the skies were filled with downed Israeli planes. The words were lies, but they were necessary ones. The truth that Egypt's defenses had collapsed in hours was too heavy to bear. The Egyptian army in the Sinai still hadn't grasped the scale of what had happened. They waited for air cover that would never come. The sound of Israeli jets overhead, sleek, fast, merciless, became constant. Every convoy, every radio truck, every armored column that moved during daylight was targeted. The desert that had seemed so vast now felt like a trap with no roof. Egyptian soldiers looked up at the sky and saw their doom circling above them. In one account, a young Egyptian lieutenant described the moment the truth set in. "We realized the air belonged to them. There was no point in running. Every shadow above us was death. For the next 48 hours, Israel ruled the skies completely. Its pilots flew hundreds of sorties a day, destroying tanks, artillery, and supply convoys. They guided ground forces across the desert like hawks leading the hunt. The Egyptian army, disorganized and blind, began to retreat not by command, but by instinct. Meanwhile, in Jordan, panic took root. King Hussein, who had reluctantly joined the war after Nasser convinced him that Egypt was winning, now faced disaster. His generals reported chaos. Communication lines with Cairo were dead. No one could confirm what was happening. But soon, Jordanian radar picked up what looked like a massive Israeli air presence, and that was enough. The illusion of strength shattered. By June 6th, the Arab capitals were locked in crisis meetings. Radio Cairo still claimed victory. Damascus broadcast patriotic songs between false reports. But by then, even the most loyal listeners felt doubt creeping in. The skies were empty, and that emptiness was deafening. For Israel, the day after Operation Focus was both triumph and terror. Triumph, because the impossible had been achieved. Terror, because now, with air dominance secured, there was no turning back. The ground war had to begin. In Tel Aviv, the pilots who had flown that morning slept only briefly before being summoned again. Their faces were pale from exhaustion, their eyes red from hours of staring into the Sunday mechanics, worked without rest, refueling and rearming planes through the night. The desert runways glowed with blue lamps, as jets came and went in rhythm, the heartbeat of a nation in motion. Yet even amid the exhaustion, there was a sense of awe. They had done something that would be studied for generations, a preemptive strike so precise, so devastating, that it redefined modern warfare. But among the pilots, there was little celebration. Many spoke quietly of the Egyptian airmen, who had never even taken off of the fire they had left behind. War, they knew, was not measured only in victories, but in silences. That night, Israel's leaders faced a new question: what now? Dayan pushed for rapid advances in Sinai. Rabin urged caution. The Arab armies were wounded, not yet defeated. But the opportunity was too great to ignore. The Sinai lay open, its defenses in disarray. To strike quickly could end Egypt's ability to fight entirely. As they debated, messages poured in from the front lines, commanders reporting movement, airmen describing wreckage, stretching for miles. The scale of destruction was staggering. In less than a day, the Egyptian airfields looked like graveyards of metal. Some pilots, realizing escape was impossible, had rammed their planes into the sand to keep them from capture. By midnight, Israeli intelligence estimated that 90% of Egypt's combat aircraft had been destroyed. Syria and Jordan had lost nearly all of theirs. The entire Arab coalition now fought with its eyes closed, while Israel's remained wide open. The world, however, struggled to comprehend what had just unfolded. In Washington, the U.S. State Department received conflicting reports, first that Israel was under attack, then that Israel had launched the first strike, then that Egypt's airfields were gone. President Johnson, after hours of confusion, reportedly muttered, "They did it. They actually did it." In Moscow, Soviet leaders were furious. They accused Israel of aggression, demanded a ceasefire, and began resupplying Egypt and Syria immediately. The Cold War had just met the desert, but the war on the ground, the one that would decide borders and lives, was only beginning. In the Sinai, Israeli ground forces started their advance. Armored divisions rolled through the night, headlights covered, dust rising behind them like ghostly veils. Pilots flew overhead, their engines low, their eyes searching for movement. In the east, Jordanian artillery opened fire on West Jerusalem, beginning another front. And in the north, Syrian gunners unleashed shells toward Galilee, unaware that their own airfields lay in ruins. The Middle East, which had held its breath for weeks, now exhaled in chaos. But through that chaos, one truth remained: the skies belonged to Israel. The air war was over, and with it, the balance of power had shifted forever. As night settled over the region, The wind carried the echoes of what had happened. The thunder of engines fading into memory, the glow of distant fires, the silence of a world that had changed before it understood why. In a single day, history had turned upside down, and though the fighting on the ground had only begun, one could already feel it. The Middle East would never be the same again. Chapter 6. Desert Thunder. The desert has a sound, a soft, endless whisper of wind over sand. But on the morning of June 5th, 1967, that whisper turned into thunder. Across the vast Sinai Peninsula, engines growled to life, tank treads bit into the sand. The Israeli ground forces, silent and patient for weeks, finally began to move. Columns of armor rolled forward, like rivers of steel beneath the pale desert Sunday. Above them, the sky once filled with Egyptian planes was now empty, wide, and Israeli. The destruction of the Egyptian Air Force during Operation Focus had opened the gates. Now, Israel would strike through them. At dawn, the Southern Command under General Yeshayahu Gavish launched its assault along three main routes into the Sinai: the northern, central, and southern corridors. Each one cut through a landscape of sand dunes, dry wadis, and scattered ridges, a geography that favored those who could move fastest and strike hardest. Israel's advantage was speed. The army's doctrine, shaped by necessity, emphasized mobility, initiative, and surprise. Against them, the Egyptian army was larger, heavily armed, but slow, disorganized, and now blind without its air support. In the north, Major General Israel Tal led his division toward Arish, pushing through the Gaza Strip and the small fortified towns that guarded Egypt's frontier. His orders were simple: reach the Suez Canal within 3 days. His tanks moved in long, thin lines, the desert stretching endlessly around them. At first, resistance was light. Egyptian outposts, cut off from command, fought in confusion. By mid-morning, Tal's forces were deep inside enemy territory, their tracks covering ground faster than even their planners had imagined. But the desert does not forgive mistakes. In one sector, the Israeli paratroopers met heavy resistance near Khan Yunis. The battle was brutal: close quarters, narrow streets, machine gun fire echoing between concrete walls. Yet the Israelis pressed on, using their air superiority to strike from above whenever resistance stiffened. Within hours, Khan Yunis fell, and the road to El Arish lay open. By the evening of June 5th, the Israelis were less than 30 kilometers from their target. The first day of the ground war had already broken Egypt's forward lines. Further south, another Israeli division advanced through the central route, led by General Ariel Sharon, a man whose name would one day become both legend and controversy. Sharon was a commander of restless energy, bold, unpredictable, and utterly fearless. His mission was to seize Abu Agila, a heavily fortified Egyptian position guarding the approaches to the Suez. Abu Agila was no ordinary outpost. It was a fortress: minefields, trenches, bunkers, artillery positions, all arranged to block any advance from the east. Egyptian intelligence considered it impenetrable. But Sharon had studied it for months. He knew its weaknesses, its patterns, and most of all, he knew how to break it. As dusk fell, Sharon ordered his forces into motion. Tanks moved under the cover of darkness, their lights dimmed. Artillery units positioned themselves behind dunes, and paratroopers flown by helicopter were dropped behind enemy lines to sow confusion and sever communications. The desert that night glowed faintly with flashes of artillery and the red trails of tracer rounds. In the silence between explosions, soldiers could hear the sound of wind and their own heartbeats. At Abu Agila, the Egyptian 2nd Infantry Division held firm. They had around 16,000 men and 90 tanks, facing Sharon's 14,000 troops and 150 tanks, but numbers meant little without coordination. The Egyptian command chain had fractured after the air attacks. Some units fought bravely, others received no orders at all. The battle began with Israeli artillery striking the Egyptian positions, pounding the defenses for hours. Then, in the dead of night, paratroopers attacked from behind, cutting off supply lines. Sharon's armored units hit from the front, driving through the minefields at high speed. The fighting was fierce, chaotic, and close tanks firing at shadows, infantry crawling through sand and smoke. Sharon himself was everywhere, standing exposed on his command vehicle, shouting orders into the desert wind. His confidence radiated through his troops. By dawn, the Egyptian positions began to crumble. Ammunition ran low, communication failed, and soldiers, terrified, exhausted, surrounded, began to retreat. At Katef, the central stronghold of Abu Agila, the Egyptians mounted a final defense. The clash was brutal, tank against tank, bayonet against bayonet. For hours, the horizon flickered with fire. But by sunrise, Sharon's forces broke through. The Israeli flag rose over the ruins. Abu Agila had fallen. That victory was more than a tactical success, it was psychological. The Egyptian command in Cairo had believed that position unbreakable. When reports of its fall reached headquarters, Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amer, Nasser's second-in-command, panicked. Convinced that the entire Sinai front was collapsing, he issued an order that would seal Egypt's fate. All units retreat immediately toward the Suez Canal. It was a catastrophic mistake. The order spread rapidly, but without coordination or timing. Units that were still holding strong abandoned their positions in confusion. Tanks and trucks clogged the desert roads. Communication collapsed entirely. The retreat became a stampede, and overhead, Israeli jets returned. From dawn until dusk, they hunted the retreating columns along the open highways. Convoys stretched for miles. Tanks, supply trucks, ambulances, all caught in the open. Pilots described the scene with a mix of awe and sorrow. It was like watching the desert itself burn. Napalm and rockets turned the sand to glass. Thousands of Egyptian soldiers threw down their weapons and ran. Many never made it to the canal. In less than 48 hours, the Egyptian army, the largest in the Arab world, was broken. But even in victory, the Israeli soldiers felt the weight of what they were witnessing. For many, this wasn't triumph, it was disbelief. They had expected a hard fight, days of struggle, heavy losses. Instead, the enemy seemed to collapse in front of them, undone by fear and chaos as much as firepower. By the morning of June 7th, the Sinai belonged to Israel. The cities of El Arish, Bir Lafan, and Jabal Libni had fallen. Israeli troops reached the Suez Canal, the symbolic border of Egypt itself. At Sharm el-Sheikh, Israeli naval units raised the blue and white flag over the Red Sea. The Straits of Tiran opened once more. Back in Cairo, Nasser's government descended into panic. Reports from the front were incoherent. Generals contradicted one another. Some insisted they were regrouping. Others admitted the truth. There was no army left to regroup. In one meeting, Nasser simply sat in silence, his hand on his forehead, as if listening to a sound only he could hear, the sound of his dream unraveling. By the afternoon of June 7th, the Egyptian retreat had turned into a disaster. The mountain passes leading from the Sinai to the Suez became killing grounds. Israeli planes struck relentlessly. In a single day, over 10,000 Egyptian soldiers were killed or captured. The rest scattered, leaving behind tanks, trucks, and weapons half buried in the sand. That evening, as the sun fell over the canal, the desert lay littered with the wreckage of a vanished army. Smoke rose from the dunes like ghosts. The silence returned heavy, endless, absolute. In the stillness, Israeli soldiers sat on the sand, staring at the horizon. Some laughed quietly, unable to believe what they had done. Others said nothing, only watching as the heat shimmered over the battlefield. For them, victory was not a shout, it was a whisper. The thunder had passed. The desert, once again, was quiet. But to the east, another front was about to awaken. One filled not with dunes, but with stone, faith, and centuries of history. For while Egypt burned in the west, Jerusalem waited in silence. And its silence would not last for long. Chapter 7. Abu Agila, the Turning Point Night, falls differently in the desert. It doesn't creep in, it arrives all at once. One moment, the horizon is gold, and the next, it is black, infinite, and silent. On the night of June 5, 1967, as the last embers of daylight faded from the Sinai sky, the Israeli army prepared to strike at the heart of Egypt's defense, Abu Agilah. To most, it was just a name on a map, a patch of desert dotted with dunes and low ridges. But to the men of both sides, it was more than that. It was a fortress, a symbol, a gateway. Whoever held Abu Agilah controlled the road across the central Sinai to the Suez Canal. For nearly a decade, Egyptian engineers had fortified it into a labyrinth of trenches, bunkers, minefields, and artillery nests. Commanders believed it was unbreakable. Israel had tried before to take it in 1956 and failed. This time they would not. The man chosen to lead the assault was Major General Ariel Sharon, commander of the Israeli 38th Armored Division. To his soldiers, he was part myth, part menace, a leader whose calm in battle bordered on defiance. Thick-set, intense, with the eyes of a man who trusted instinct over orders, Sharon paced the sand before sunset, memorizing every ridge and hollow. He had studied Abu Agilah for months. He knew the minefields stretched 6 miles wide. He knew Egyptian artillery covered every approach. He knew the trenches were layered in depth like waves. And yet he also knew something the Egyptians didn't, that the battlefield could be bent if struck from every direction at once. His plan was audacious. He would attack not from one front, but from 4, all within the same night. Artillery would soften the defenses. A paratroop brigade would land behind enemy lines to cut communications and create confusion. Tanks would breach the minefields head-on, while infantry flanked from the north. Each movement would depend on the others, timed to the minute. It was war choreographed like a symphony, and the desert would be its stage. As the last light faded, the silence broke. Israeli guns opened up with a roar that rolled across the dunes like thunder. For nearly 3 hours, the night pulsed with the rhythm of explosions. Shells burst over the Egyptian trenches, lighting the darkness with flashes of white and orange. Dust clouds rose and hung in the still air, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Behind that curtain of noise, Sharon's tanks began to move, steel beasts crawling through the dark, guided by compasses and instinct. Their drivers couldn't see more than a few meters ahead. Every shadow might hide a mine, every glint might mark a gun. Engineers crept before them on foot, sweeping for mines under fire, clearing narrow paths. In places, men used their bodies to shield the detonations from those behind them. To the north, paratroopers dropped from helicopters, their boots sinking into soft sand behind Egyptian lines. They spread out quickly, cutting telephone wires, blowing up supply dumps, and attacking artillery crews from the rear. Egyptian officers, confused and surrounded, radioed frantic messages to headquarters. "We are under attack from every direction." But there was no headquarters left to answer. At Ketef, the core of the defensive line, the Egyptians fought with desperate courage. Machine guns stitched red lines through the night. Mortars fell like rain, yet for every bunker silenced, another roared to life. The Israelis advanced slowly, step by step, sometimes crawling, sometimes running. Every meter cost lives. By midnight, Sharon's artillery shifted fire deeper into the Egyptian positions. The paratroopers, now joined by tanks, pressed inward. The desert shook with noise, a continuous rumble like the earth itself groaning. Men shouted orders through static and sandstorms of dust. Somewhere near the center, a tank hit a mine and erupted into flame, lighting the faces of soldiers who kept moving forward. Through it all, Sharon remained calm. He moved between units by jeep, refusing to use radio for fear of interception. In one moment witnessed by his officers, he stood atop a dune, tracer rounds flying past, his binoculars fixed on the battlefield as though willing it into shape. "Keep pushing," he said softly. "We finish this tonight." By the early hours of June 6th, the Egyptian line began to crack. Without air cover, isolated and confused, their resistance started to falter. Reports of paratroopers in the rear spread panic. Some units fought on bravely, others abandoned their posts in darkness, leaving weapons behind. Tanks that tried to retreat became trapped in the sand, easy targets for Israeli gunners. Then came the final assault. At 3 a.m., Sharon ordered a coordinated push from all sides. Artillery fire ceased, and into the brief silence came the roar of hundreds of engines. Israeli armor surged forward, headlights cutting through the smoke. Infantry followed close behind. The defenders at Katef fired their last rounds as the Israeli tanks burst through the final line of trenches. One by one, the Egyptian positions fell. By dawn, Abu Aguila was silent, not with peace, but with exhaustion. When the sun rose, the scale of the battle revealed itself. The desert floor was scarred with craters and wrecked vehicles. Smoke drifted lazily from the remains of bunkers. Israeli medics moved among the wounded, Egyptian and Israeli alike. In one captured trench, a young Egyptian soldier sat against the wall, staring blankly ahead, his rifle across his knees, his eyes filled not with hatred but disbelief. At 6 a.m., Sharon radioed headquarters 2 words that would echo through military history: Abu Aguila secured. The message hit Cairo like a physical blow. For the Egyptian High Command, the fortress at Abu Aguila had been their pride, the anchor of their defense, the symbol of their strength. To lose it was unthinkable. Yet the impossible had happened. Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amer, Nasser's top commander, reacted not with strategy, but with panic. Convinced that the entire front was collapsing, he ordered a full retreat from the Sinai. No plan, no coordination, just retreat. What might have been a controlled withdrawal turned into chaos. Armored divisions fled westward in confusion. Trucks collided on narrow roads. Columns jammed mountain passes. Israeli reconnaissance planes reported the sight of hundreds of vehicles pouring toward the Suez Canal in disorder. Sharon's victory had not just broken a fortress, it had broken the Egyptian army's will. For Israel, Abu Aguila became the hinge on which the entire war turned. It was the moment the momentum shifted irrevocably. With the Egyptian army in retreat, the path to the canal lay open. Within 48 hours, Israeli forces would reach the western edge of the Sinai. That morning, Sharon climbed a small rise overlooking the battlefield. The sun was high now, its heat already fierce. He looked out over the wreckage, the twisted metal, the endless dunes, and said quietly to his adjutant, "This will be studied for generations." He was right. Military academies around the world would later dissect the Battle of Abu Aguila as a masterclass in coordination and maneuver. Yet for those who fought it, the memory was not theory but sensation. The smell of cordite, the taste of sand, the sound of comrades' voices fading into static. Back in Cairo, Nasser faced the hardest truth of all, that his dream of Arab unity had met its first and greatest test and failed. The speeches, the songs, the banners of triumph, they all seemed like echoes from another age. In a single night, the balance of power in the Middle East had shifted. For the soldiers still fighting on the edges of the Sinai, the orders were now simple: retreat, survive, cross the canal if you can. But the desert shows no mercy. Israeli jets hunted the fleeing convoys from above. Artillery harried them from behind. The road to the Suez became a corridor of smoke. By the night of June 6th, the battle for Abu Aguila was over, and with it ended any hope of Egyptian recovery. In the stillness that followed, a strange calm settled over the dunes. The stars came out, cold and indifferent, shining on the wreckage of men and machines. Somewhere among them, a lone radio crackled faintly with static, the last whisper of a battle that had already become legend. The turning point had come, and history was now moving west, toward the canal, unstoppable, relentless, and silent as the desert wind. Chapter 8: Collapse in the Desert. The desert, once alive with thunder, fell into confusion. Across the endless sands of the Sinai, what had begun as an army's withdrawal became something darker, a slow, unfolding disaster. It started at dawn on June 6th, as the smoke still rose from Abu Aguila. The Egyptian High Command, shocked by the fortress's sudden fall, struggled to comprehend what was happening. Orders came, were contradicted, and then came again. Reports from the front were garbled, delayed, or lost. Some officers believed reinforcements were arriving, others believed the entire front had been annihilated. In Cairo, Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amer, overwhelmed and panicked, issued a single fateful command: withdraw all forces from the Sinai immediately. It was an order made not from strategy, but from fear, and in the desert, fear spreads faster than fire. The retreat began in fragments. Tanks turned their guns westward, trucks loaded with soldiers roared toward the mountain passes, and artillery units abandoned their guns to escape the coming storm. What should have been an organized withdrawal became chaos, a vast tide of men and machines flowing west, colliding, choking the roads, trapped by the geography of their own homeland. To the north, Israeli divisions under General Israel Tal pushed forward with relentless precision. His tanks cut through the fleeing columns like blades through water. To the south, Sharon's forces advanced rapidly, their treads leaving long scars across the dunes. Between them, the Egyptian army disintegrated, and above it all, the sky was alive again, not with Egyptian planes, but with the shadows of Israeli jets. From early morning to nightfall, Israeli pilots hunted the retreating forces across the open desert. The radio chatter was brief, methodical. Convoy spotted, coordinates locked. Then silence, followed by thunder. Rockets streaked downward, leaving trails of fire in the air. Trucks exploded, tanks burned, and men scattered into the sand. One pilot later said, "It was not war anymore, it was punishment." The Sinai, so wide and empty, became a trap. The heat rose to unbearable levels. Engines overheated, fuel ran low, and soldiers, desperate for water, abandoned their vehicles and walked. Many died of thirst before reaching the passes. Others were buried alive under the collapsing dunes as explosions shook the earth. By noon, the retreat turned to rout. At Jabal Libni, Egyptian units fought desperately to hold back the Israeli advance, but with no air cover and no orders, their defense crumbled. Tank commanders watched in disbelief as their comrades fled, their vehicles abandoned and still running. Officers shouted for order, but their voices were swallowed by the wind. In the chaos, entire divisions vanished. Communication with Cairo was gone. Radios emitted only static. The army that had once numbered 100,000 men in the Sinai now moved as scattered fragments, blind and leaderless. At the same time, in Cairo, President Gamal Abdel Nasser waited for news that never improved. Each report that reached him was worse than the last. Abu Aguila had fallen. El Arish was lost. The passes were under attack. He asked for confirmation, for maps, for updates, but no one could give him a clear picture. He stared out at the Nile from his office, silent, his face heavy with disbelief. "The army is still fighting," one aide said. Nasser shook his head. "The army is gone," he whispered. Meanwhile, in the desert, the Israeli pursuit grew more aggressive. General Tal's armored columns advanced westward toward the Suez Canal. Their tanks, Centurions and Pattons, rolled over abandoned Egyptian equipment like ghosts passing through wreckage. The desert roads were littered with twisted metal, scorched uniforms, and shattered glass. The scent of fuel and smoke clung to everything. Israeli soldiers, hardened by years of training but unprepared for what they were seeing, moved through scenes that felt unreal. In one sector, they found hundreds of Egyptian vehicles still idling, their drivers gone. In another, they came upon a convoy destroyed mid-flight trucks lined up like skeletons against the dunes. It was like the desert itself had consumed them, one soldier later said. As the day wore on, the retreating Egyptian troops reached the Mitla and Gidi passes, narrow corridors through the mountains that led toward the Suez Canal. Thousands of men and machines jammed into these canyons, desperate to escape. Tanks collided, trucks overturned, and the air filled with the roar of engines and the cries of the wounded. Then came the jets. At noon, Israeli aircraft began bombing the passes. Napalm canisters fell first, followed by rockets and 30mm cannon fire. The walls of the mountains reflected the sound, amplifying it until the air itself seemed to scream. Fires burned through the packed convoys, turning steel into ash and sand into glass. The flames were so intense that some soldiers simply lay down and waited for it to be over. When the smoke cleared, the passes were littered with the dead, thousands of men who had once believed they were marching to victory. Historians would later call it the massacre in the passes. For the blader intention, soldiers who survived it, there was no name, only the memory of heat and fire. By the evening of June 7th, the Sinai was lost. The Israeli army had reached the Suez Canal, the symbolic line between Egypt and the world beyond. At Sharm el-Sheikh, Israeli troops raised their flag over the Red Sea once more, reopening the Straits of Tiran that had sparked the war. The campaign that Cairo believed would last weeks had ended in 3 days. In Cairo, silence replaced speeches. Crowds gathered in the streets, their faces blank, waiting for the voice of Nasser. But none came. Radio Cairo still played patriotic songs, but the tone had changed. The anthems of triumph sounded hollow, now echoes of pride fading into despair. Inside his office, Nasser sat with Field Marshal Amer. Their conversation was quiet, almost subdued. Amer tried to insist that the army could regroup, that the war wasn't over. Nasser said nothing. Finally, he stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the city. "The dream," he murmured, "has ended." Back in the desert, the victors moved through the ruins of what had been one of the largest armies in the Middle East. Israeli officers walked among the wreckage in silence, the magnitude of what they had done only beginning to sink in. They had expected resistance, they had found collapse. For the soldiers who had fought their way across the Sinai, victory felt unreal, like waking from a nightmare that hadn't yet ended. They sat on the dunes, drinking from their canteens, staring at the horizon. The air was still thick with smoke, and the smell of burned oil. One of them said softly, "We came to survive, not to conquer." That night, as the desert cooled and the stars reappeared, the scale of the war became clear. 15,000 Egyptian soldiers were dead. Thousands more were missing or captured. Nearly all of Egypt's heavy equipment lay scattered across the sand. The 6-day war was barely halfway over, but its X-time daughter, the outcome was already being written in the silence of the Sinai, a silence broken only by the whisper of the wind over burnt metal and forgotten dreams. The thunder had passed, leaving only echoes. And far to the east, as the last fires of the desert flickered out, another front stirred awake Jerusalem. Its walls, its stones, its prayers, they would soon feel the weight of history once more. Chapter 9, Voices of the Nile. Cairo, June 7, 1967. The morning sun rose quietly over the Nile, its reflection trembling on the slow-moving water. From a distance, the city seemed at peace. The call to prayer echoed softly between its minarets. Taxis hummed through dusty streets, and the same river that had carried the stories of pharaohs and kingdoms now carried a nation's sorrow. But beneath the surface, Egypt was breaking. In government buildings and army offices, telephones rang unanswered. Typewriters clicked, then stopped. Maps lay forgotten on tables, dotted with red pins that no longer meant anything. The war, once declared with confidence and pride, was unraveling faster than anyone could understand. News from the Sinai arrived in fragments. Retreating, lost contact, all units destroyed. Each message hit like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the fragile calm of the capital. The men who had planned for triumph were now left with silence, uncertainty, and the bitter taste of disbelief. At the center of it all sat President Gamal Abdel Nasser, once the voice of a revolution, now a man surrounded by failure. The room around him was dim, its curtains drawn against the glaring Sunday. He looked older than his 49 years. Gone was the fiery orator who had electrified crowds from Casablanca to Baghdad. In his place sat a man weighed down by ghosts of soldiers lost in the desert, of dreams collapsing like sandcastles in the tide. On his desk lay a single telegram from the front: Sinai lost, army in full retreat. He read it once, then again, and finally set it down. His hands trembled slightly. He had built his reputation on strength, the unbreakable will of Egypt reborn. Yet now, even his generals refused to meet his gaze. Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amer, his lifelong friend and the commander of the armed forces, paced the room nervously. His uniform, once immaculate, was stained and wrinkled. The two men had been inseparable since the Free Officers' coup of 1952. Together, they had toppled kings, defied empires, and dreamed of a new Arab order. But now, in the quiet of that office, their partnership felt like a memory from another age. Nasser finally spoke, his voice low, almost detached. "What happened, Hakim?" Amr didn't answer right away. He stared at the floor, searching for words. "We were not ready. The Israelis struck first. Their planes, everything, was gone before we could respond." Nasser's eyes lifted, tired, hollow. "You told me we were ready," he said. "You promised me." Amer's silence was answer enough. The air between them grew heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken blame. Outside, the noise of the city grew louder. Car horns, radios, murmurs. Word was spreading. Despite the government's efforts to control the narrative, rumors of defeat were racing through Cairo like wildfire. Some said the army had been betrayed. Others said the Americans and British had joined the Israelis in secret, but most simply couldn't believe it. Egypt, the heart of the Arab world, the pride of Nasser's revolution, brought to its knees in less than 3 days? It was unthinkable, and yet the truth was undeniable. The voice of the Arabs, the state radio that had once boomed across the region with confidence, struggled to fill the silence. The announcers' voices were strained, uncertain. For years, they had spoken of victory and destiny. Now, they spoke of strategic redeployment and temporary setbacks. But even those words faltered under the weight of what everyone already knew. That afternoon, Nasser met with his cabinet. Ministers shuffled into the room quietly, avoiding each other's eyes. The discussion was brief, somber, and confused. One suggested appealing to the United Nations. Another urged an immediate ceasefire. A third spoke of revenge. Nasser listened without expression. When they were done, he stood, straightened his jacket, and said softly, "The people must know." That evening, the entire country waited. Radios were turned up in cafes, in shops, in homes. Families gathered around small wooden boxes that crackled with static. Children sat on the floor, sensing the tension in their parents' silence. At 9 p.m., Nasser's voice came through the airwaves. He spoke slowly, each word deliberate. He admitted the truth that Egypt had suffered heavy losses, that the army had been defeated, that the situation was grave. But he did not shift blame. Instead, he shouldered it. "I take full responsibility," he said. "I have decided to step down from the presidency and allow others to continue the struggle." The words struck Cairo like an earthquake. For a moment, there was only silence. Then came the sound, faint at first, then swelling into a roar, the sound of thousands of voices shouting, "No! Nasser! Nasser!" Crowds flooded the streets, filling Tahrir Square, the bridges, the Corniche. Men wept openly. Women raised their hands to the sky. They refused to let him go. For all his failures, Nasser was still the heart of Egypt's identity. The man who had stood against empires, who had given them pride when they had none. To lose him now, in the midst of humiliation, felt like losing the last anchor of hope. The chants grew louder, echoing across the river. "We are with you, Nasser. We are with you." Inside the presidential palace, aides rushed to the windows, astonished. The streets were overflowing, not with anger, but with devotion. Nasser listened, silent. The same people who had cheered him into power now begged him not to leave it. For hours, the city was alive with voices, the voices of a nation refusing to surrender its faith, even in defeat. By midnight, Nasser agreed to stay. The next morning, state radio announced it. President Nasser has withdrawn his resignation at the request of the people. The crowds cheered, but beneath the jubilation lay something deeper, quieter, an understanding that things could never be the same again. Egypt had lost more than a war. It had lost its illusion of invincibility. In the days that followed, the Nile carried on, indifferent to human sorrow. Fishermen cast their nets as always. Children played in narrow alleys, unaware of the scale of what had happened. But for the adults, for the soldiers returning from the desert with hollow eyes, the world felt different, smaller, heavier. Across the Arab world, shockwaves rippled outward. In Jordan, King Hussein wept privately in his palace. In Syria, generals raged and plotted revenge. In Baghdad, angry mobs filled the streets, blaming everyone: the West, the Americans, even fate itself. And in the refugee camps of Gaza and the West Bank, the people who had already lost everything once now faced a new, harsher reality. Nasser's voice still echoed across radios, but its tone had changed. Gone was the triumphant fire. In its place came something more human, a weary, wounded determination. "We will rebuild," he said. "We will not bow." But even as he spoke, the river outside seemed to whisper another truth, that some wounds never truly heal. The Six-Day War was not just a military disaster, it was an emotional one, a collapse of faith, a breaking of spirit. It marked the end of an era when speeches could move mountains, when a single man's dream could unite a continent. Yet in the ruins of that dream, something else began to stir, a quieter, more personal awakening. People began to question, to look inward, to seek new meanings in defeat. The chants that once demanded glory now turned into prayers for peace. And though the war still raged on in the north, though the guns had not yet fallen silent in Jerusalem or the Golan Heights, along the banks of the Nile, a different kind of silence took root, not of despair, but of reflection. The voices of the Nile had spoken not in victory but in truth, and truth, painful as it was, would be the beginning of something new. Chapter 10, Jerusalem Divided. For 19 years, Jerusalem had lived in two halves, a line of barbed wire and stone cut through its ancient heart, a scar separating families, faiths, and memories. On one side stood West Jerusalem, under Israeli control, alive with markets and modern life. On the other, East Jerusalem, held by Jordan, guarded by soldiers who watched the old city from the walls that had once sheltered prophets. To the world, the city was wholly sacred to three religions, a place where time itself seemed to bend. But in June 1967, holiness could not protect it. The prayers of thousands hung in the same air that smelled faintly of gun oil and dust. When the war began on June 5th, Jerusalem was not supposed to be a battlefield. Israel's leaders hoped to avoid fighting Jordan entirely. The plan was simple: focus on Egypt, then turn north to Syria if needed. But war rarely listens to plans. That morning, as Israeli jets bombed Egyptian airfields in the south, King Hussein of Jordan received word from Cairo that Egyptian forces were triumphing, that Israeli planes were being destroyed in waves. The message was false, a desperate lie sent by Egyptian commanders to save face, but Hussein believed it. He feared missing the chance to join a great Arab victory, and feared even more being remembered as the one who stood aside. At 10 a.m., Jordan's artillery opened fire. Shells rained down on West Jerusalem, smashing into homes, schools, and synagogues. The air filled with dust and sirens. The holy city trembled. Across the front line, Israeli troops in bunkers along no man's land returned fire, their shots echoing between the limestone hills. The war had come to Jerusalem again. Israeli commanders hesitated. They knew that any move toward East Jerusalem, and especially the Old City, would ignite fury across the Arab world. For 2 decades, the world had treated that land as untouchable. sacred even in division. But as artillery shells struck the city's neighborhoods, hesitation gave way to necessity. By midday, Moshe Dayan, Israel's newly appointed Minister of Defense, gave the order, "Take Jerusalem." The Israeli Jerusalem Brigade, a reserve unit hastily gathered from nearby bases, advanced toward Government House, a UN compound on a hill overlooking the city's southern edge. The fighting was fierce. Jordanian troops from the elite Arab Legion fired from bunkers dug deep into the ridges, their shots cracking through the stone like thunder. Israeli soldiers, unused to the urban terrain, fought block by block, doorway by doorway. The hills that had seen prophets and kings now witnessed a modern kind of war, chaotic, intimate, and unrelenting. The battle for Government House lasted hours. Bullets ricocheted off ancient walls. Mortars struck olive trees and shattered them to splinters. When the Israelis finally captured the hill, they were bloodied and exhausted. From its heights, they could see the old city, its domes and minarets, gleaming faintly in the evening light, separated by only a few hundred meters, but centuries of conflict. On the second day of fighting, June 6th, the Israelis launched a broader assault. 3 brigades converged on East Jerusalem from different directions. The Jerusalem Brigade from the south, the Harel Mechanized Brigade from the west, and the 55th Paratrooper Brigade from the north. The city, built for prayer, not for war, became a maze of gunfire and smoke. The paratroopers, led by Colonel Mordechai Gur, moved through narrow streets near Mount Scopus and Ammunition Hill, where Jordanian bunkers had been dug deep into rock. The battle there became one of the bloodiest of the war. Israeli soldiers charged up steep slopes under heavy fire, their paths choked with barbed wire and mines. For hours, they fought hand to hand, grenade to grenade. By dawn, Ammunition Hill was a ruin, its trenches filled with silence and dust. Out of 180 Israeli paratroopers who had begun the assault, only 40 remained standing. The rest lay scattered across the earth they had fought to claim. But they had done it. The Jordanian defenses around northern Jerusalem had collapsed. In the south, the Harel Brigade captured Latrun and Bethlehem Road, cutting off Jordanian reinforcements. The 163rd Battalion pushed toward Abu Tor, securing the ridge that overlooked the old city's walls. Step by step, Israel closed the circle around East Jerusalem. By the evening of June 6th, the two halves of the city divided since 1948 were once again face to face. Inside the old city, Jordanian commanders prepared for the inevitable. Their troops were tired, low on ammunition, but determined to hold the sacred ground. The minarets still called for prayer. Bells still rang faintly from the churches. But beneath those sounds, the city waited not in peace, but in dread. That night, the Israeli cabinet debated whether to enter the old city. Some feared that doing so would provoke international outrage or destroy holy sites. Others argued that stopping now would betray the soldiers who had already given everything to reach its gates. Dayan, always decisive, made the choice. "The paratroopers will go in," he said. "But no tanks, no artillery. We will fight with respect." At 4 a.m., on June 7th, as dawn crept over the hills, the 55th Paratrooper Brigade gathered near Lionsgate, one of the ancient entrances to the Ebenus Old City. The streets were eerily quiet. The sound of birds mingled with the distant echo of gunfire. The air smelled of stone, smoke, and history. Then came the command, "Move." The paratroopers advanced through the gate, rifles raised, eyes wide. Inside, the narrow alleys twisted in every direction. Stone passageways built centuries ago, now filled with shadows and echoes. They moved carefully, knowing that every doorway could hide an ambush, every archway could hold a sniper. But the Jordanians inside were exhausted. Many had already withdrawn, leaving only small pockets of resistance. A few bursts of gunfire echoed through the ancient streets, and then silence. At 10 a.m., a radio transmission crackled through the Israeli command net. 7 words that would enter history. "Har Habayit Biadinu." The Temple Mount is in our hands. The old city had fallen. The paratroopers reached the western wall, that last remnant of the ancient Jewish temple, long separated from their people by war and politics. Some soldiers wept, others stood silently, unable to speak. One removed his helmet and pressed his forehead against the cool stone. Their commander, Mata Gur, raised the blue and white flag above the wall. Over the radio, Moshe Dayan's voice came through calm, solemn. "We have reunited the city," he said. "We have returned to our holiest places, never to part from them again." But even in triumph, there was restraint. Dayan ordered that the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque remain under Muslim control. "We did not come to destroy," he said. "We came to return." Outside the city, the world reacted in awe and alarm. For Israel, Jerusalem's reunification was a miracle, the fulfillment of centuries of longing. For the Arab world, it was humiliation layered upon grief. A holy city, their holy city, had fallen to the very enemy they had vowed to erase. That night, as Israeli soldiers walked the quiet alleys of the stirring Jerusalem, the city seemed to exhale, not in relief, but in disbelief. Bells tolled faintly from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The muezzin's calls drifted over the rooftops. And somewhere, beyond the hills, the Jordanian army retreated eastward across the River Jordan. The city that had been divided for 19 years was whole again. But peace was still a far dream. For while Jerusalem stood silent under the stars, new fires were already flickering in the north. On the cliffs above the Galilee, the guns of Syria were waiting, and soon they too would speak. Chapter 11, Ammunition Hill. Before dawn on June 6, 1967, the city of Jerusalem was quiet, too quiet. The air hung heavy, thick with dust and waiting. Somewhere far off, the bells of a church rang faintly, echoing against the limestone hills, and beyond them, soldiers waited in silence, their hearts pounding louder than the sound of their boots. They were the Israeli paratroopers of the 55th Brigade, and ahead of them stood Ammunition Hill, a small rise of earth and stone that would become one of the bloodiest pieces of ground in modern Jerusalem. It was not a mountain, not even a hill in the grand sense. Just a ridge, dotted with bunkers, trenches, and barbed wire, but its position commanding the road between Mount Scopus and East Jerusalem made it the key to the city. Whoever held Ammunition Hill held the gate to Jerusalem's heart. The Jordanians knew this well. For 19 years they had fortified it, 350 men from the Arab Legion, trained by the British, hardened by years of quiet tension. Their trenches were deep, their bunkers reinforced, their guns well placed. To reach them, the paratroopers would have to cross open ground under fire, through mines, wire, and shadows. At 2:30 a.m., the order came, "Move out." The paratroopers moved in silence, their helmets wrapped in netting, their rifles slung tight. The air was cool, but the sand was still warm from the dawn. Previous day's Sunday, every sound felt magnified. The scrape of boots, the click of safety catches, the distant bark of a dog somewhere in the dark city below. They crossed a narrow wadi, then began to climb. Ahead of them, Ammunition Hill loomed black against the faint gray of approaching dawn. Suddenly, the night split open. Machine guns erupted from the Jordanian bunkers. Tracer fire sliced through the air like fiery threads. Mortars exploded among the advancing Israelis, throwing dirt and men into the air. Shouts and cries mingled with the sharp crack of rifles. The paratroopers scattered for cover, returning fire, crawling through the rocky ground. The smell of gunpowder, mixed with the sweet scent of olive trees torn by shrapnel. The battle had begun. It was chaos, pure and immediate. Communication broke down almost instantly. The plan dissolved in the confusion of darkness and smoke. Squad leaders shouted, but their voices were lost in the roar. Some units veered left, others right, stumbling into unexpected trenches. What had been neat lines on a map became a maze of survival. By 4 a.m., the paratroopers had reached the outer wire. Engineers crawled forward with cutters, slicing through the metal while bullets sparked around them. The first wave charged through, only to find the ground rising before them, a network of trenches stretching like veins into the hill. Each trench was its own world, narrow, suffocating, alive with movement and death. The Israelis dropped into them one by one, firing as they went. The Jordanians fought back fiercely, refusing to give ground. They fired from behind sandbags, from tunnel entrances, from bunkers carved into the earth. Every meter was contested, every shadow a danger. In one trench, an Israeli sergeant turned a corner and came face to face with a Jordanian soldier. Both froze, both fired. The two shots became one, and both men fell together. Their rifles clattered onto the same patch of stone. Elsewhere, medics worked in the dirt, pulling the wounded back toward cover. One young medic, barely 19, crawled across open ground again and again under fire. Years later, he would say he didn't remember the fear, only the hands reaching out to him from the dust. By 5 a.m., the first light of dawn revealed the scale of the fight. Smoke hung low over the hill. The paratroopers, covered in dust and blood, pressed forward trench by trench, grenade by grenade. Each explosion echoed off the old stone walls, reverberating through the city like distant thunder. Captain Rafi Perez, one of the company commanders, moved through the trenches with quiet determination. When his men faltered, he shouted, "Forward! We finish this now." Minutes later, a burst of fire caught him in the chest. His soldiers carried him to a shallow ditch, but he waved them off, urging them to keep moving. "Don't stop," he whispered. "Not here." They didn't. The Jordanians counterattacked twice, surging through the maze of trenches, but were driven back each time. Their discipline was extraordinary, firing, falling back, firing again. Many of them fought to the last bullet. For them, this was sacred ground too, the defense of a city they believed was their duty to protect. By 7 a.m., the sun climbed over the Mount of Olives, washing the battlefield in pale gold. The paratroopers had been fighting for nearly 5 hours without pause. Ammunition was running low, water was gone. Some men fought with captured weapons, their hands shaking from exhaustion, but slowly, inch by inch, they gained ground. At 8 a.m., the last Jordanian bunker fell. The remaining defenders surrendered or slipped away into the narrow streets of East Jerusalem. The hill was silent again, except for the cries of the wounded and the crackle of burning brush. When the Israeli commander walked across the ridge, he stopped and looked around. The trenches were filled with bodies, friend, and foe lying side by side. Of the 180 men who had stormed the hill, 97 were dead. Half the battalion had fallen in a space no larger than a city block. And yet, they had done it. Ammunition Hill was theirs. The soldiers who survived didn't cheer. They didn't shout or raise flags. They sat in silence, staring at the city below the domes of Jerusalem, glowing faintly in the morning Sunday. Some cleaned their rifles. Others lit cigarettes with trembling hands. One young paratrooper found a patch of shade beside a bunker, leaned against the wall, and fell asleep where he Saturday. That afternoon, a radio crew arrived to record what had happened. The surviving commander spoke softly into the microphone. It was dark. We couldn't see each other. The Jordanians fought hard. We fought hard. There was no fear, only the sound of breathing and fire. When it was over, there was no victory, only quiet. The recording was broadcast across Israel that night. Families sat in their homes listening, tears in their eyes. For many, it was the first time they heard what their sons had endured to reach the heart of the city. Ammunition Hill became a symbol not of triumph, but of sacrifice. A hill no higher than a few meters, yet soaked with the weight of centuries. That evening, as the sun set over Jerusalem, the paratroopers who remained gathered at the summit. They looked toward the old city, its walls catching the last light. Somewhere beyond them lay the Western Wall, the place they had been told they might never see. They didn't speak much. They didn't have to. The silence said everything. The war was still raging. The city was not yet whole, But for those who had fought on Ammunition Hill, something had already changed forever. They had crossed the line between fear and courage, between history and myth. And as night fell again over Jerusalem, the wind that blew through the trenches seemed to whisper the names of the fallen, soft, endless, and eternal. Chapter 12. The Temple Mount is in our hands. The morning of June 7th, 1967, began in stillness. A thin mist drifted over the hills of Jerusalem, carrying with it the scent of stone, smoke, and pine. For the paratroopers of the 55th Brigade, the city lay before them silent, wounded, and waiting. They had fought all night, through trenches and bunkers, through the blood-soaked maze of Ammunition Hill, and now stood at the very threshold of history. Ahead of them rose the ancient walls of the old city, golden in the morning light, crowned with domes that had seen kings, crusaders, and prophets. For 19 years, those walls had been off-limits, divided by war, guarded by the soldiers of Jordan's Arab Legion. On one side, the Jewish world had prayed from afar. On the other, Jordanian guards patrolled streets where time seemed frozen. The Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, had been hidden from its people for a generation. And now, at last, the gates were open. At 8:30 a.m., the order came from command: advance into the old city. It was a command uttered softly, almost reverently, not shouted, not cheered. The men who heard it understood its weight. This was not just a mission, it was history unfolding beneath their boots. They approached from the Lion's Gate, one of the few entrances still intact. The road leading to it was narrow, flanked by stone walls and olive trees scarred by bullets. The soldiers moved quietly, rifles ready, their boots crunching softly on the dust. Birds fluttered from the rooftops as they passed. Somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of gunfire lingered, the last remnants of resistance fading away. At the gate itself, the men paused. The archway rose before them, tall, ancient, and silent. Beyond it lay centuries of longing. Then, with a breath, they stepped through. The first paratroopers entered the old city of Jerusalem at 9:45 a.m. They moved cautiously through the narrow alleys, their helmets brushing against hanging wires and awnings. The streets were deserted, the air thick with the smell of dust and smoke. Every corner turned revealed more stone, old, beautiful, eternal. They expected ambushes, snipers, traps. But none came. The Jordanians had withdrawn during the night, leaving only silence in their place. It was as if the city itself had been holding its breath. Through the winding streets, the paratroopers advanced toward the sound of bells and prayer. Then, as they emerged into an open courtyard, they saw it, the dome of the rock, shimmering beneath the sun like molten gold. The blue tiles glowed against the pale sky, the calligraphy along its walls glinting in the light. For a moment, no one spoke. Many of these soldiers had grown up hearing stories of this place, the heart of faith, the soul of their people, the dream whispered in prayers for 2,000 years. Next year in Jerusalem. And now they stood in that very city, weapons slung over their shoulders, their boots resting on stones older than memory. Colonel Mota Gur, their commander, raised his radio handset. His voice, calm and trembling all at once, crackled through the static. Har Habayit Be'adinu. The Temple Mount is in our hands. Those 7 words traveled farther than gunfire ever could. They crossed mountains and borders, oceans and generations. They were heard in Tel Aviv, in New York, in Paris, in synagogues where men wept openly, in homes where grandparents clasped their hands in disbelief. For the Jewish people, scattered and scarred by centuries of exile, those words were not just an announcement, they were a return. Back in Jerusalem, the paratroopers continued forward until they reached a narrow archway leading into a quiet courtyard. Beyond it lay a wall high, ancient, made of massive limestone blocks. It was the Western Wall, the last remnant of the Second Temple, untouched since antiquity. The soldiers stopped. Some stared in silence, others removed their helmets. One man, unable to contain himself, broke down and wept. The sound of his crying echoed softly against the stones. They approached slowly. Some kissed the wall. Others pressed their foreheads against it. The coolness of the stone met the warmth of their skin. It was as if time itself had folded past and present meeting in a single breath. A military chaplain, Rabbi Shlomo Goren, arrived carrying a small Torah scroll and a shofar. His uniform was dusty, his face streaked with tears. He lifted the shofar to his lips and blew. The sound, ancient, trembling, defiant, cut through the air like a heartbeat. It echoed off the domes, the alleys, the skies above. In that moment, for many, the war stopped. The gunfire, the politics, the fear, all of it, faded beneath the sound of that single note. Cameras captured it. Reporters wrote about it. But for those who were there, no photograph, no headline could capture what they felt. It was not victory. It was not conquest. It was something quieter, deeper, a reunion between people and place. Later that day, Moshe Dayan, wearing his black eye patch, arrived at the site. He walked through the crowd of soldiers and stood before the wall. The cameras clicked, but his expression was not triumph. It was solemn, reflective. He turned to his officers and said, "We have returned to the holiest of our places. We have come not to destroy, but to live in peace with those of other faiths. We did not come to Jerusalem to desecrate, but to restore." Then, turning to his staff, he made a decision that would shape the city's future. The Islamic Waqf would continue to administer the Al-Aqsa Mosque and Dome of the Rock. Muslim worship would remain untouched. Jerusalem, though under Israeli control, would remain a city of many faiths. For some soldiers, this was confusing, even painful. They had risked everything to reach this place, and yet were being told to step back. But Dayan's words carried a weight. Beyond the battlefield, this was not to be a conquest of stone, but of conscience. As the day drew on, civilians began to emerge cautiously from their homes. Old men in robes, women clutching children, shopkeepers peering from doorways. The soldiers greeted them quietly, exchanging nods rather than words. The city had seen too much blood to bear more. By evening, the sun cast long shadows over Jerusalem. The domes gleamed like fire, and the air cooled. The soldiers of the 55th Brigade gathered once more at the western wall. They sang softly, not in celebration, but in reverence. The melody drifted through the alleys, blending with the distant call to prayer. For the first time in centuries, all the faiths of Jerusalem, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity heard each other's songs carried on the same wind. That night, the paratroopers slept inside the old city. Some laid their rifles beside them and used their helmets as pillows. Others couldn't sleep at all. They sat awake, staring at the moonlit stones, wondering if they were still dreaming. Outside, the world reeled from the news. In Cairo, in Amman, in Damascus, the headlines were bitter. The unthinkable had happened. The city that was supposed to unite the Arab world had fallen. In Israel, tears of joy mixed with exhaustion. Radio announcers' voices broke mid-sentence. "Jerusalem," they said, "is once again united." But history is never so simple. For while Jerusalem was reunited by war, it would remain divided in hearts. The same stones that inspired prayer for some became reminders of loss for others. Yet on that day, June 7th, 1967, none of that could overshadow the moment itself. The soldiers who stood at the wall didn't think of politics or diplomacy or borders. They thought only of their fathers, their grandfathers, and the thousands who had prayed but never lived to see this dawn. And as the first stars appeared over Jerusalem, the city breathed again, not in peace, but in memory. For in those few sacred hours, Jerusalem was not just a city. It was the heart of history, and it was beating once more. Chapter 13, The Fall of the West Bank, June 7th, 1967. The same sun that rose over the golden domes of Jerusalem now spread across the hills of Judea and Samaria, the land the world would soon call the West Bank. It was the fourth day of the war, and by now, the air itself seemed heavy with the memory of what had already been lost. From Jerusalem to Hebron, from Ramallah to Nablus, the hills rolled quietly beneath the pale sky. Villages lay tucked between olive groves, their minarets thin against the morning light. For centuries, time here had moved slowly, a rhythm of prayer, harvest, and hope. But that morning, it moved with tanks. When the battle for Jerusalem ended, Israeli commanders received a new order: advance across the West Bank, secure the highlands, eliminate remaining Jordanian resistance. The words were simple. The implications were not. For Israel, the West Bank represented both danger and destiny. It was from these hills that Jordanian artillery had shelled Israeli cities for years. But it was also the land of history, the terrain of prophets, kings, and memory. Hebron, Bethlehem, Jericho, names older than any flag. Now, in the shadow of victory, Israel was about to reclaim them and inherit the burden that came with them. The advance began at dawn. From the south, armored columns of the Jerusalem Brigade pushed toward Hebron. From the north, the Harel Mechanized Brigade swept through Ramallah, while paratroopers moved through Nablus, the ancient city of Jacob's Well and the Samaritans. The Jordanian army, already shattered by the collapse of the Egyptian front, offered scattered resistance. Some units fought bravely, others retreated, cut off from orders. The once disciplined Arab Legion, the pride of Jordan, had been stretched thin, defending Jerusalem, and could no longer hold the line. At Bethlehem, Israeli forces met brief resistance at the edge of town. Shells fell near the Church of the Nativity, that ancient cradle of faith. But the battle was short. Within hours, white flags appeared on rooftops. Soldiers entered quietly, their boots echoing on cobblestone streets. They passed homes where curtains were drawn tight, where families whispered prayers that the storm would pass them by. In Hebron, the story unfolded differently. For centuries, the city had been home to both Muslims and a small Jewish community until 1929, when violence drove the Jews out. Now, 38 years later, Israeli troops approached again, but not as pilgrims. They came as soldiers. When the tanks rolled into Hebron's outskirts, the townspeople braced for destruction. But instead, the sound that came was strange silence. The mayor of Hebron walked out to meet the Israeli commander carrying a white cloth. Behind him, a group of elders followed. There were no gunshots, no defiance, only the quiet dignity of surrender. Inside the city, Israeli soldiers moved carefully through the narrow lanes. Shops were shuttered. The air smelled of dust and old stone. In the heart of Hebron stood the Cave of the Patriarchs, the resting place of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a place sacred to Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike. The soldiers stopped before it, uncertain. One of them whispered, "My grandfather told me stories about this place." They did not enter. They simply stood and looked, caught between reverence and war. Further north, the paratroopers advancing on Nablus met fierce resistance from Jordanian gunners stationed in the hills. The fighting lasted into the afternoon, bursts of fire echoing across the valleys. The Israelis called in air support. Within hours, smoke curled up from the ridges. When the firing stopped, the city surrendered. The cost was high on both sides. Dozens of Jordanians lay dead among their artillery guns. There, uniforms covered in dust. Israeli soldiers walked among them silently, collecting weapons, checking for survivors. In the streets of Nablus, shopkeepers stood at their doors, watching in disbelief as foreign soldiers, young, sunburned, weary, moved past their homes. By nightfall, the West Bank had fallen. Hebron, Bethlehem, Nablus, Jericho, Ramallah, all under Israeli control. The war that had begun as defense had become something else, an expansion no one had fully planned, but none could deny. From his headquarters in Tel Aviv, Moshe Dayan received the reports one after another. The magnitude of what had happened was staggering. In just 4 days, Israel had taken more land than in all its previous wars combined. But the victory brought with it questions that no general could answer. Questions about borders, about people, about the future. Because in conquering the West Bank, Israel had also inherited its people, nearly 1 million Palestinians, most of them civilians. Farmers, shopkeepers, refugees from 1948, now living under Israeli occupation. For many, this was not liberation, but a new chapter of uncertainty. In the refugee camps near Jericho, families listened to the distant rumble of tanks. Mothers held their children close, whispering that it would soon be over. But when the noise faded, the silence that followed felt permanent. Israeli soldiers distributed water and food to villagers. Some spoke Arabic, others simply gestured kindly. In many places, the occupation began not with violence, but with an uneasy politeness, the cautious truce between conqueror and conquered. Yet beneath that quiet surface, something deeper stirred. Defeat had not erased memory. In every town, people whispered, "This will not last." Back in Amman, King Hussein faced his own reckoning. His kingdom, once stretching from the desert to the river, had been cut in half. His army broken, his people humiliated. Yet, unlike Nasser, he did not resign. He simply bowed his head, his eyes heavy with grief. "We did what we could," he told his ministers. "Now we must survive." In Israel, celebration was tempered by disbelief. Soldiers returning from the West Bank were greeted with tears and songs, yet none of them felt victorious. One officer wrote in his diary, "We thought we were fighting for safety. Now we hold a land that will not let us rest." He was right. The West Bank would not be easily forgotten. It was land layered with faith, sacred to Jews as Judea and Samaria, to Muslims as part of the heart of Palestine. Every stone, every olive tree carried history. And now, that history belonged to both, and neither. That night, Israeli troops set up checkpoints along the Jordan River, the new frontier. Across the water, the lights of Jordan shimmered faintly in the distance. A few soldiers stood by the banks, looking east, wondering if they would ever cross again. In the quiet towns behind them, the people of the West Bank began to wake to a new reality. Some raised white flags from their rooftops, afraid of punishment that never came. Others opened their shops cautiously, selling bread to the same soldiers who had entered their cities only hours before. Life, somehow, began to move again slowly, unevenly, but forward. But in the hearts of those who lived there, a question lingered, soft but sharp as the desert wind. Was this the end of one war, or the beginning of something far longer? Because though the guns were falling silent, the war itself, the one between memory and belonging, had only just begun. And as night returned over the hills of Judea, the lights of Hebron, Bethlehem, and Nablus flickered faintly against the dark. The same stars that watched Abraham and David now looked down upon soldiers and civilians alike and saw, as history always does, that no victory lasts forever. Chapter 14. The Golan Heights. By the dawn of June 9, 1967, the war had already been decided, but not yet finished. To the south, Egypt's army lay shattered in the sands of Sinai. To the east, the West Bank had fallen. Jerusalem stood reunited beneath a single flag, and yet in the north there remained one last frontier high, defiant and silent, the Golan Heights. For years, the Golan had been a fortress above the clouds, a plateau of basalt cliffs rising more than 2,000 feet above the Galilee plain. From its edge, Syrian artillery had shelled Israeli farms, tractors, and villages below. Children in Kibbutz Dan and Kibbutz Gadot had grown up diving for cover at the sound of distant guns. To them, the Golan wasn't just geography, it was fear. And now, with the war's momentum unstoppable, Israel turned its eyes to those cliffs. The decision was not easy. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol hesitated. The terrain was treacherous, the Syrian defenses formidable. Every approach road was mined, every ridge fortified. To assault the Golan would mean climbing straight into fire. "It will be a cemetery for our boys," one general warned. But in the north, the people of the Galilee were pleading for action. For years, they had lived beneath Syrian guns. Now, for the first time, those guns were silent, their operators shaken by the collapse of Egypt and Jordan. If not now, the commanders argued, then when? On the morning of June 9th, after long debate, Moshe Dayan gave his quiet consent. The order spread like a whisper through the ranks. "We are going to the heights." The air attacks began first. Israeli jets streaked north, flying low over the Sea of Galilee, then climbing steeply toward the dark plateau. Bombs fell across Syrian positions, trenches, bunkers, command posts. The earth shook. But the Syrians were ready. From hidden batteries, they fired back with artillery so fierce it made the mountains tremble. Behind the smoke, Israeli ground forces began their ascent. At the front was Colonel Albert Mandler's 8th Armored Brigade, moving up a narrow road from Givat HaEm, the Mother's Hill. It was a name both poetic and cruel. The climb was steep, the heat unbearable. Tanks labored over the rocks, their engines screaming, their crews choking on dust. Each meter forward brought them under new fire. Syrian shells exploded on the slopes, tearing through steel and sand. Mines littered the road. Ambulances followed the columns, already full before they reached the first ridge. The soldiers pressed on. They had been told that if they reached the top, the rest would follow. But reaching the top meant climbing through hell. By noon, the first Israeli units broke through the lower defenses. Syrian soldiers fought with grim determination, firing from bunkers carved into the rock. Their commander, Brigadier General Ahmad Suwaidan, refused to retreat. "This is Syria's honor," he radioed. "We do not give up the heights." But honor could not stop the collapse that had already begun elsewhere. The Syrian army, disoriented and frightened by Israeli air superiority, struggled to coordinate its defenses. Communication lines failed. Commanders argued. Some batteries fired on their own, retreating columns by mistake. Still, the fight was brutal. The 8th Brigade stormed Tel Faher, a heavily fortified Syrian stronghold. The trenches there twisted through black volcanic stone, deep and narrow, perfect for ambush. The Israelis advanced grenade by grenade, clearing each section with bayonets and sheer will. One soldier later said, "It wasn't war, it was crawling through death." By the time the position fell, half his unit was gone, but the road ahead was open. Elsewhere, the 181st Battalion attacked Tel Hilal and Dardara, strongholds guarding the central Golan. They moved on foot, climbing steep slopes under machine gun fire. The heat was suffocating. The smell of cordite and dust clung to their skin. When they finally reached the summit, they found Syrian soldiers fleeing north, leaving behind maps, rifles, and photographs of families pinned inside bunkers. That night, the Israelis dug in on the plateau. For the first time in decades, the guns that had looked down on the Galilee were silent. Below them, the lights of Israeli villages flickered like stars. Farmers stepped out of their shelters and looked upward. The same cliffs that had once brought fear now seemed still, almost peaceful. "Maybe now," one man said, "we can let our children play outside." But the war was not yet done. At dawn, on June 10th, reinforcements climbed the mountain roads, 8 Israeli brigades in all. The final push began under a gray sky heavy with dust. Tanks rumbled across the plateau toward Quneitra, the Syrian regional capital. Resistance was sporadic. Many Syrian units had already withdrawn north toward Damascus, leaving only scattered rearguards. As the Israelis advanced, they passed abandoned positions, artillery guns still warm, radios still crackling with unanswered calls. The sense of ghostliness was everywhere. A few civilians stood by the roadside, staring wordlessly as the columns rolled past. At Quneitra, a last pocket of Syrian troops opened fire. The exchange lasted less than an hour. When the Israelis entered the town, it was already deserted, its residents gone, its windows shattered. A single Syrian flag hung limply from a pole. A soldier climbed up and pulled it down. At 12 p.m., the ceasefire was declared. The war was over. 6 days. That was all it had taken to redraw the map of the Middle East. From the Suez Canal to the Golan Heights, Israel now held territory 3 times its original size. The Sinai, Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan, all captured. The armies of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria all defeated. But the soldiers who stood on the Golan that afternoon did not feel like conquerors. They looked out across the valley below, toward the Sea of Galilee, shimmering in the distance, and saw not victory but silence, the kind of silence that comes after something too large for words. They had survived, but many of their friends had not. The smoke of battle still drifted on the wind. Down below, the people of the Galilee emerged from their shelters. Children pointed at the distant cliffs. Farmers raised their heads from the soil, and for the first time in years, the sound that filled the air was not artillery but birds. In Damascus, President Hafez al-Assad, then defense minister, seethed with rage. He vowed that the Golan would one day return to Syria, that this was not an end, but a beginning. His words would become prophecy in 1973. But on this day, there was nothing left to fight for. On the mountain plateau, Israeli medics moved between craters, gathering the wounded. The basalt under their boots was dark, stained with oil and blood. One soldier knelt beside a fallen comrade and whispered, "We did it. We're done now. Rest." That night, the stars over the Golan were bright, so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The soldiers lay beneath them, wrapped in blankets, the sound of the wind rustling through the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a radio played faintly, an announcer's voice trembling with emotion. "The war is over. Israel has prevailed." But the men who heard it knew the truth. Wars never really end. They only change their shape. The Golan Heights would remain in Israeli hands, but peace would not come with it. The land itself, stark, beautiful, silent, would become a border of memory, a place where the past stared down at the present. As dawn rose on June 11th, the soldiers packed their gear. They looked once more across the valley below green fields, silver water, the life they had fought to protect. Then they turned back toward the mountain, now theirs, and began to walk. Behind them, the wind whispered through the grass, and in its whisper, the echoes of 6 days carried on echoes of fire, faith, and the fragile peace that always follows victory. Chapter 15: Ceasefire and Consequence. June 11th, 1967. The 6th sunrise of the war rose over a region forever changed. From the Suez Canal to the Golan Heights, the air was finally still, the silence of a battlefield after the roar has faded. The guns had stopped, the maps were redrawn, but peace did not arrive with the ceasefire. It was 11 a.m. when the final orders came across the radios: "Ceasefire, hold your positions." In the Sinai, Israeli tank crews shut down their engines and climbed out into the blazing heat. In Jerusalem, paratroopers leaned against ancient walls, their faces streaked with dust and tears. On the Golan Heights, exhausted soldiers sat in the shade of burned-out tanks, staring into the endless sky. Across the front lines, silence spread like a living thing. The 6-day war, so brief, so explosive, had ended. But in its wake, it left behind a new Middle East, a smaller Arab world, a larger Israel, and a deeper wound than any general could measure. In less than a week, Israel had seized more territory than it had ever dreamed possible. To the south lay the Sinai Peninsula, stretching 200 miles from Gaza to the Suez Canal. To the north, the Golan Heights, a plateau that loomed above the Galilee. In the east, the West Bank, with its cities of Hebron, Nablus, Jericho, and the jewel of all, East Jerusalem. Before June 1967, Israel had controlled 8,000 square miles. After June 1967, it controlled more than 26,000. A victory beyond calculation and a burden beyond imagining. The numbers told their own story. Israel had lost fewer than 1,000 soldiers, 983 dead. The Arab coalition had lost more than 20,000, 15,000 Egyptians, 700 Jordanians, 2,500 Syrians. Thousands more were wounded, captured, or missing in the desert heat. Airfields across Egypt were graveyards of twisted metal. 400 aircraft reduced to blackened wrecks. In the Sinai, tank columns lay scattered across the sand, their tracks half buried, their crews long gone. In the streets of Jerusalem, smoke still drifted from shattered rooftops, the scent of gunpowder lingering in the morning breeze. War, when it ends, never truly vanishes. It lingers in the smell of stone, in the eyes of the living, and in the silence of the dead. In Cairo, the news arrived like thunder. The Egyptian capital, once filled with chants of victory and Nasser forever, fell silent. Radios that had broadcast confidence now played laments. When President Gamal Abdel Nasser finally spoke, his voice was low, weary. He took responsibility for the defeat, and then, in a moment that shook the Arab world, he announced his resignation. Crowds flooded the streets, weeping, shouting, begging him to stay. For many Arabs, Nasser was more than a leader. He was pride itself, the symbol of unity, defiance, and hope. Within a day, he withdrew his resignation, carried back into office by the sheer will of his people. But something had changed. The dream of pan-Arabism had cracked in 6 days. In Amman, King Hussein of Jordan grieved quietly. He had lost not just land, but the holy city of Jerusalem. His army, the proud Arab Legion, lay broken. When foreign journalists asked him about the war, he replied softly, "We fought with courage, but courage is not always enough." In Damascus, Syria's leadership seethed with rage and shame. The Golan Heights, the symbol of its power, was gone. Hafez al-Assad, then Minister of Defense, vowed revenge. His words echoed into the future, and in them lay the seeds of the next war. Around the world, the 6-day war sent shockwaves through governments and hearts alike. In the West, it was seen as a miracle. A small nation, surrounded and outnumbered, had survived against impossible odds. In the East, it was seen as tragedy, a humiliation that could not be forgotten. At the United Nations, diplomats hurried to draft a resolution that might hold the world together. Months later it came, Resolution 242. It called for Israel's withdrawal from occupied territories, and for every nation's right to live in peace within secure and recognized borders. Its words were deliberate, its meaning ambiguous. For decades, it would be debated, reinterpreted, and rarely fulfilled. In the conquered lands, a strange quiet settled. In Gaza, in Hebron, in Nablus, in Jericho, Israeli soldiers now stood guard on street corners where Jordanian police once patrolled. Signs were repainted, checkpoints appeared where there had been none. For some, the Israelis were seen as liberators from old regimes. For most, they were occupiers. A new generation of Palestinians, children of refugees from 1948, found themselves living under another flag, another army. Their parents spoke of return. They grew up speaking of resistance. In the refugee camps, the 6-day war was not a line of victory, but a circle of grief. Families who had fled once now fled again, from the West Bank to Jordan, from Gaza to Egypt. They carried little but keys, photographs, and the memory of homes they might never see again. Back in Israel, jubilation mingled with disbelief. In the streets of Tel Aviv, people danced. Soldiers came home to crowds of flowers and songs. Yet beneath the celebration was something quieter, awe, and a question few dared to ask aloud: what now? For the first time, Israel controlled not just land, but millions of Arabs within its borders. How could a nation built on survival govern another people without losing itself? For some, the answer was faith. They saw the victory as divine proof, the fulfillment of prophecy. For others, it was dread, a moral weight that no army could carry for long. One young paratrooper wrote in his diary, "We entered the old city and touched the wall, and for a moment, I felt peace. But now, standing guard in Hebron, I wonder what have we truly won." His words, fragile and uncertain, would echo through generations. In the following weeks, prisoners were exchanged. The dead were buried. Cities began to rebuild. The world's attention moved on, as it always does, to the next crisis, the next speech, the next headline. But in the quiet corners of the Middle East, people remembered. In Egypt, widows waited for husbands who would never return. In Israel, families hung photographs of sons who had fallen in deserts they couldn't pronounce. In the West Bank, farmers looked out over fields, now divided by wire and watchtowers. The war was over, but it was not finished. The Yom Kippur War of 1973, the Lebanon War, the Intifadas, all of them would be born in the silence that followed. June 1967. The Six-Day War lasted 144 hours, but its echoes have lasted for decades. It reshaped not just borders, but belief in armies, in nations, in destiny. It changed how the world saw Israel, how Arabs saw themselves, and how faith and politics fused into a conflict that no longer had a beginning or an end. That evening, as the sun set over Jerusalem, a young soldier sat on the steps near the Western Wall. The city glowed amber in the fading light. He removed his helmet, placed it beside him, and closed his eyes. He thought of his friends buried in the Sinai, of the Jordanian soldier he had seen fall on Ammunition Hill, of the words he had heard through the radio, "The Temple Mount is in our hands." They had sounded like triumph. Now they sounded like responsibility. Above him, the call to prayer rose from the minarets. Church bells answered from across the valley. The old city breathed wounded, sacred, eternal. And somewhere in that silence, between the echoes of victory and the shadow of sorrow, the soldier whispered the same words that everyone in that land had whispered at least once before. Maybe next year, there will be peace. Chapter 16, The Human Cost. In every war, there comes a morning when the guns fall silent, but the crying does not. June 12, 1967 was such a morning. The desert winds that once carried the sound of artillery now carried something softer, the whisper of grief. Across the Middle East, the war was over, but its ghosts had just begun to speak. Along the dunes of Sinai, the sun rose over a sea of twisted steel. Burned-out tanks sat half-buried in the sand like bones of some great beast. The bodies had mostly been buried, but the tracks of retreats still scarred. The earth tire marks, frozen in dust, helmets left where men had fallen. Israeli soldiers moved quietly among them, collecting weapons, searching for survivors who had been missed. The air smelled of oil and salt. In the distance, vultures circled, where the road disappeared toward Suez. For the families of the dead, the war never ended. In Cairo, funerals filled the streets. Mothers in black carried framed photographs through narrow alleys, their wails echoing between the buildings. In one courtyard, a little boy sat beside a coffin draped in an Egyptian flag and asked when his father would wake up. No one could answer him. In Tel Aviv, the grief was quieter but no less real. The price of victory was counted name by name, face by face. Soldiers who had been cheered just days before now returned home, draped in flags. Some were buried in long rows beneath white stones. Others lay in silence in fields near the front, their names marked only by wooden signs and a helmet resting on top. The newspapers printed photographs of smiling faces, men and boys who looked like they could have been anyone's sons. In Jerusalem, where crowds had once wept with joy at the sound of the shofar, widows now wept alone at the gates of the military cemetery. The same city that had seen paratroopers embrace before the Western Wall now watched those same men carry coffins on their shoulders. A victory born in 6 days, but mourned for a lifetime. Across the Jordan River, the human toll was harder to see but heavier to bear. In the refugee camps near Jericho, women gathered around makeshift fires, baking flatbread on tin sheets. The air was filled with the cries of children and the rustle of canvas tents. Old men sat together, staring at the horizon where their villages once stood. They spoke of olive trees, of courtyards left behind, of sons lost on the battlefield. One man clutched a rusted house key on a string around his neck. It was all he had left of home. In the fields of the West Bank, life tried to resume its rhythm. Farmers went out at dawn, pushing plows through the soil, their eyes glancing nervously at the Israeli jeeps passing on the roads above. In Bethlehem, church bells rang again, not for peace but for funerals. In Hebron, the streets were eerily quiet, as if the city itself had gone into mourning. And in Gaza, where the smell of salt met the dust of war, thousands of families found themselves displaced once more, their tents forming cities of sorrow beneath a burning sky. Soldiers on both sides carried their own invisible scars. Some had seen too much, others too little to understand what they had survived. In the hospitals of Tel Aviv, men lay in long rows of white beds, their faces bandaged, their arms missing, their eyes open but distant. Nurses moved softly between them, adjusting blankets, offering water. Outside, volunteers read letters from home, words of love, written by wives and mothers who still didn't know the full cost of the war. In Damascus, wounded Syrian soldiers returned to silence. There were no crowds waiting for them, no parades. They arrived in convoys at night, their trucks covered with tarpaulins, the air thick with shame. Some refused to speak of what had happened on the Golan. Others swore vengeance through clenched teeth. "We will return," they said. "The heights will not remain lost forever." In Amman, King Hussein visited hospitals himself. He moved quietly through the wards, speaking to soldiers who could barely lift their heads. When one of them apologized for failing, the king took his hand and said, "You did not fail. You stood your ground." His voice broke as he said it. For Israel, the war had brought something it had never known before, the sense of being unstoppable. But even in victory, there was a shadow. The captured land was vast, but filled with people who did not wish to be ruled. Soldiers who had fought for survival now found themselves standing guard at checkpoints, searching the bags of civilians their own age. It was a new kind of battle, quieter, colder, one fought in the uneasy stillness between occupier and occupied. Some Israeli soldiers wrote home about the strange feeling of power they did not want. One wrote to his wife, "They tell us we are heroes, but here, standing over these people, I feel smaller than I did before." Others described acts of kindness, giving food to children, helping the elderly cross roads, small gestures that tried to soften a truth that could not be softened. Among Palestinians, the loss was not just land, it was identity. The flags came down, the borders shifted, and suddenly, their world belonged to someone else. In refugee camps, poets began to write in exile, their verses filled with dust and longing. "We do not remember the war," one poet wrote, "we live inside it." In Cairo, President Nasser appeared once more on national television. His face looked older. His voice, once thunderous, was tired. "This defeat is not the end," he said. "It is the beginning of renewal." But even he knew that the spirit of Arab unity had cracked. The dream of a single Arab world had been buried beneath the sands of Sinai. Meanwhile, in the heart of Israel, something unexpected began to stir doubt. For the first time since its founding, the nation faced the question of what to do with victory. Some believed the land should be traded for peace. Others believed it was destiny to keep it forever. The arguments began almost as soon as the fighting ended, and they have never truly stopped. In the streets of Jerusalem, the soldiers who had once stormed Ammunition Hill now walked quietly through the markets. Some returned to the Western Wall to pray, their hands trembling as they touched the cold stone. They had conquered the city, but the weight of what they had done pressed on them in ways they could not describe. Night fell slowly over the region. From the rooftops of Amman to the alleys of Cairo, lights flickered and went out one by one. Families gathered around radios, listening to the same news in different languages, each side telling a different story, each story carrying the same sorrow. In a small kibbutz near the Galilee, a mother sat by an open window, holding a letter from her son who would never return. He had written it before the war began, on paper, folded neatly in an envelope that smelled faintly of lavender. It said only, "Don't worry, it will be quick." She read it over and over until the words blurred. In a camp outside Jericho, a Palestinian girl looked up at the night sky and asked her grandmother when they would go home. The old woman smiled faintly and pointed to the stars. "When they fall," she said. "When they fall, we will go home." The war was over. The guns were quiet, but across deserts and valleys, through barbed wire and broken cities, the grief moved on, the wind heavy, endless, unspoken, and as the moon rose over the land, it looked down upon the same faces on both sides, mothers waiting, fathers remembering, children dreaming. In the silence of that long night, the Middle East began to count the true cost of 6 days that would echo for generations. Chapter 17. The Shattered Dream. When the dust settled over the Middle East, the banners that had once flown proudly in Cairo, Damascus, and Stapping as Weber, Amman hung limp in the wind. The 6-day war had not only redrawn the borders of nations, it had shattered an idea. The dream that had carried a generation of Arabs through revolution, hope, and pride. The dream of unity now lay buried beneath the ruins of Sinai and the silence of the Golan Heights. In the years before the war, the Arab world had stood at the edge of what it believed was destiny. Young men spoke of liberation, of a single flag stretching from the Atlantic to the Gulf. Radio stations played speeches from Cairo, filled with the voice of one man who had come to embody that hope, Gamal Abdel Nasser. His words were thunder. He promised that the age of humiliation was over, that the Arab world would rise, that Israel would fall, and millions believed him. But June 1967 had broken that thunder into silence. In Cairo, the shock of defeat was not just military, it was spiritual. The city that had once pulsed with chants of pride now echoed with disbelief. The streets that had celebrated nationalization of the Suez Canal and victory at Port Said now carried the weight of funerals. Nasser, once invincible, appeared on television to a nation that no longer recognized his face. His voice, once filled with defiance, trembled with shame. "We have faced a great disaster," he said. "I bear full responsibility." The next day, the people filled the streets, millions of them, crying his name. They begged him to stay. They could not imagine Egypt without him. He stood on the balcony of the presidential palace and looked down at them, the same crowd that had once cheered his revolution, now weeping as if for a fallen father. He withdrew his resignation, but the man who stayed in power was not the same one who had spoken of glory. He carried the war like a wound that would never heal. Across the Arab world, something deeper began to fade. The speeches stopped echoing. The posters of unity were taken down. In Damascus, the officers who had sworn to destroy Israel now spoke only in whispers about betrayal, about fear, about the next war that would be needed to erase the shame of this one. Hafez al-Assad, the cold and calculating defense minister, looked at the wreckage of the Golan and vowed it would not stand. "We will not forget," he told his men. "We will not forgive." In Amman, King Hussein faced a kingdom in mourning. Half his country was gone. The soldiers of the Arab Legion returned barefoot, their uniforms torn, their faces hollow. The old city of Jerusalem, the heart of faith, was lost. At night, the king sat alone in his palace, staring at maps that no longer made sense. "I was born on a battlefield," he said once, "and I will die on one." The dream that had begun with so much fire now burned only in anger. Arab nationalism, the belief that one people could unite under a single purpose, had been humiliated, not by politics, but by the battlefield. It had promised dignity and delivered disaster. The younger generation no longer looked to Cairo or Damascus for leadership. They turned inward to religion, to rebellion, to despair. The Arab world was awake, but it no longer dreamed. In Israel, the mood was the opposite, triumphant, yet uneasy. The country had faced the armies of 3 nations and emerged not just alive, but ascendant. Soldiers who had expected annihilation returned as heroes. Streets were renamed, songs written, children born in those 6 miraculous days were called Nitzah victory. But beneath the pride, there was an unease that no one wanted to voice. For the first time, Israel had become something it had never wanted to be, an occupier. It now ruled over nearly 1 million Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza, a people who did not share its faith or its flag. The soldiers who had stormed the old city with tears in their eyes now stood at checkpoints inspecting the papers of strangers. They felt it, the tension between victory and virtue, between survival and control. In the cafes of Tel Aviv, people argued about destiny. Some said the land had been given to them by God, that it was theirs forever. Judea, Samaria, the mountains of the prophets. Others warned that holding it would poison them. One writer compared it to drinking salt water. The more you consume, the thirstier you become. But the voices of caution were drowned out by the sound of celebration. Israel had never been stronger. Few realized how fragile that strength truly was. Across the region, the superpowers watched with cold interest. Washington saw a new ally rising. Moscow saw its clients broken and humiliated. The Cold War had found another front, and the Middle East became its newest fault line. Soviet advisors returned to Cairo. American aid flowed to Tel Aviv. The next war, though no one could name it yet, was already forming in the silence. But for the ordinary people, the farmers, the shopkeepers, the mothers' ideology meant little. Their lives were measured not in borders but in absence. In Egypt, young men who had marched proudly to the Sinai were missing, their names whispered at dinner tables like prayers. In Syria, families received letters that said only, "Your son fought bravely for the homeland." In Jordan, entire villages disappeared from the map, replaced by ghost towns and minefields. Even in victory, Israel felt the weight of loss. For every parade, there was a hospital ward. For every song of triumph, a mother's quiet grief. The soldiers who had returned alive carried something invisible in their eyes, a look that said they had seen the edge of history and stepped back from it, but not unscarred. In the refugee camps, the days blurred together. Children played with cans for toys. Old men told stories of orchards and cities that now lay behind enemy lines. Some believed they would return soon, that this occupation was temporary. Others knew better. "We have become a people of waiting," one woman said. "Waiting for the war, waiting for peace, waiting for a home." And in that waiting, something began to change. The silence of defeat hardened into resolve. Underground groups formed. Secret meetings were held. A name began to circulate: Fatah, the movement that would soon define the Palestinian struggle. Out of loss, a new cause was born, one that would outlast generals, kings, and presidents alike. By the time summer gave way to autumn, the world had moved on. Newspapers wrote of ceasefires and peace conferences, but the land itself remembered. In Sinai, rusted tanks became monuments. In Jerusalem, tourists walked streets where men had died. On the Golan, the wind whistled through empty trenches. The dream of unity once sung in every Arab capital had fallen asleep. In its place stood nations nursing their own wounds, each one promising that next time would be different. But next time would come, and it would look much the same. The Six-Day War had lasted only a moment in history, yet it had turned the century on its axis. It created a new Israel, a new Palestine, a new Arab world, and it left behind a silence that stretched far beyond its 6 days. a silence filled with the weight of everything that might have been. On a quiet evening in Cairo, Nasser stood by his window, looking out over the city he had once believed he could remake. The streets below were dim, the Nile moved darkly beneath the bridges. Somewhere, a radio played a love song from before the war. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he was just a man listening to the city breathe. Then he turned away from the window, his shoulders heavy, and whispered to himself. The dream was not wrong, only the timing. But history, like the desert, shows no mercy for timing. The dream had shattered, and the echo of its breaking would haunt the Middle East for generations to come. Chapter 18: The Occupied Lands. When the war ended, the land exhaled, but it did not rest. The guns were silent now, yet the sound of marching boots still lingered in the streets, in the alleys, in the hills where smoke had only just begun to clear. The maps were different, the flags had changed, but for the people who lived beneath them, the war had only transformed into something quieter and more complicated. The occupation had begun. In the first days after the ceasefire, Israeli soldiers moved cautiously through the newly conquered territories. Their uniforms were faded from sun and sand, their eyes heavy from sleepless nights. They had fought 6 days that felt like 6 lifetimes. Now they found themselves in strange cities: Hebron, Nablus, Jericho, Gaza, names they had known from the Bible, now alive in a modern silence. The air smelled of dust and fear. Doors were half open, streets deserted. Only the echo of their footsteps answered them. In the West Bank, old men stood at the edges of their olive groves, watching the jeeps pass. They neither saluted nor ran. They simply watched, as if staring could tell them whether this new power would bring ruin or order. For the most part, the Israelis tried to keep their distance. There were orders: do not provoke, do not harm, do not forget they are not your enemies, only your new reality. But soldiers are not diplomats, and fear moves faster than discipline. In Gaza, the resistance came first. Crowds gathered, stones flew, shots rang out in narrow streets. The army moved in cautiously, uneasy in the maze of concrete and shadow. A young lieutenant wrote in his journal, "We were trained to fight armies, not people." His words carried the confusion of many. They had won the war, but they had inherited something far more fragile: a people, a memory, a rage that had no flag, but burned like fire beneath the calm. For the Palestinians, the days after the war were a blur of disbelief. They had lived under Jordanian or Egyptian rule, and now they woke to find Israeli soldiers on every corner. Checkpoints appeared overnight. Curfews were announced by loudspeakers. Posters of kings were torn down. Hebrew road signs went up. The rules of life had changed, and yet no one had explained them. Mothers sent their sons to fetch water, whispering prayers that they would return. Farmers crossed fields they had plowed for generations, now marked by fences and armed guards. And still, life went on, because it had to. Markets reopened slowly. Bakers lit their ovens. Children peeked from behind doorways, curious about the soldiers in green who stood where policemen once had. Some soldiers smiled at them. Others looked away, uncomfortable. For a brief time, there was a strange politeness between the occupied and the occupiers, a silence that felt like the pause before a storm. In Jericho, the soldiers set up headquarters in an abandoned police station. They worked beside a small palm tree that leaned toward the desert wind. One of them, barely 20, began learning Arabic from a boy who sold bread outside the gate. They traded words for coins, laughter for mistrust. But behind their gestures lay the truth both already knew: that kindness under occupation is never simple. In Hebron, the silence was different. The city, sacred to both Jew and Muslim, breathed uneasily under its new rulers. Israeli patrols passed through its narrow streets where prophets once walked. Every turn carried memory. The soldiers who had dreamed of returning to this city as pilgrims now entered as guardians and feared what that meant. One wrote home, We came to protect, not to possess. But what if one day we forget the difference? In the refugee camps, despair took on a new shape. People built new walls inside old tents. The names of lost villages were whispered like prayers. In the evenings, men sat together under dim lamps, smoking, plotting, remembering. They spoke of Fatah, of resistance, of the belief that no occupation lasts forever. In one camp, a teacher told his students, "The map has changed, but we have not. The land remembers us, even if we cannot return to it." In Israel, the occupation was both a triumph and a test. The government struggled to understand what had been gained and what had been trapped inside that gain. The euphoria of victory faded quickly as the enormity of control settled in. Generals debated how long the army could stay before it became something it was never meant to be. Politicians spoke of exchanging land for peace, but peace was silent, distant, uninterested. A group of young reservists returned home to find that they could not celebrate. "We saw their faces," one said of the Palestinians. "They looked at us not with hatred, but with exhaustion. That is more dangerous. You can fight hatred, but how do you fight hopelessness?" His words spread quietly through cafes and classrooms. The victory had been absolute, the morality of it less so. For the Arab nations, the occupation was an open wound. Cairo, Damascus, and Amman spoke of ceasefire, but the language beneath their speeches was vengeance. The radio stations that once sang of victory now filled the air with defiance. Poets wrote of loss turned to duty, of sons who would reclaim what their fathers had lost. And in the refugee camps, boys grew up with these words in their ears like a drumbeat. In Jerusalem, the city of three faiths, the lines were redrawn again but not erased. The Israeli flag flew over the old city, yet the call to prayer still echoed across its rooftops. Christian bells rang from their towers, and Jewish prayers murmured against the ancient stones. For a brief moment, all three faiths coexisted under a single fragile calm. But beneath it, tension hummed, like a wire stretched too tight. As the weeks passed, the world began to look away. The newspapers turned their pages to other crises, other wars, but the occupation did not fade. It grew roots, administrative, military, human. Children born after 1967 grew up in its shadow, never knowing the world before it. Roads were built. Settlements began as tents, then turned to concrete. Checkpoints hardened into borders. And yet, amid all of it, small acts of humanity survived. Fragile, stubborn, defiant. A soldier shared water with a thirsty farmer. A nurse treated a wounded child without asking which flag his father served. A teacher, forbidden to speak of history, taught her students the meaning of patience instead. The Six-Day War had lasted 1 week. The occupation it created would last generations. It would become the thread that tied every peace, negotiation, every uprising, every moment of fragile hope. It was a wound disguised as order, a calm that never truly rested. Years later, one of the Israeli soldiers who had marched into Hebron would write in his memoir, "We thought the war ended in 6 days, but on the 7th, we woke up and realized it had just changed its shape." And in the camps, in the fields, in the cities divided by checkpoints and fences, the people who lived beneath that shape, the occupied, and the occupiers began to understand that the hardest part of war is not the fighting, it is the living that comes after. The land was quiet now, but its silence was alive. It carried footsteps, whispers, and memories of those who once believed that 6 days could end a century of struggle. Instead, it had only begun another. Chapter 19. The Unseen Front. When the battles ended and the soldiers returned home, another kind of war began. One fought not with guns, but with whispers, cables, and ink. It was quieter, cleaner, but no less ruthless. The Six-Day War had redrawn borders, but now came the struggle to redraw the story to shape what the world would remember, what the people would believe, and what the future might justify. It was the unseen front fought in embassies, newsrooms, and the hidden rooms of power. In Tel Aviv, the mood of triumph had already begun to fade into calculation. Israel had done the impossible, but victory brings its own kind of fear. The generals who had commanded armies now found themselves facing diplomats, journalists, and questions with no clear answers. How long could they hold the land? What should they offer for peace? What story would the world accept? The Ministry of Foreign Affairs became a war room of a different kind. Maps were replaced with press briefings, strategies with statements. Every sentence carried the weight of history. "We acted in defense," they said to the world. "We struck first, but only because we had no choice." It was not a lie, but it was also not the whole truth. In the quiet corners of diplomacy, the truth always bends to fit necessity. In Washington, the war had caused surprise and admiration. American officials watched in awe as Israel's lightning strike reshaped the Middle East in less than a week. But admiration carried danger. For every headline calling it a miracle, there was another warning that it would draw the United States deeper into a conflict it could never control. President Johnson, calm but cautious, told his aides, "Israel may have won the war, but now we must help them win the peace." In Moscow, the reaction was fury wrapped in denial. The Soviet Union had armed and trained the Arab armies, had promised them parity, even victory. Now, it faced humiliation. The Kremlin's first instinct was silence, then condemnation. Radio Moscow called the war imperialist aggression. Soviet ships sailed to the Mediterranean, carrying more weapons, more promises, more anger. The Arab leaders who had lost the war were summoned to Moscow, where words of solidarity mixed with veiled threats. The Cold War had not ended in Vietnam or Berlin. It had simply moved to the desert. But beyond politics, something else was happening, a war for memory. In Cairo, newspapers spoke of betrayal, of spies, of American aircraft disguised with Israeli markings. It was easier to believe in conspiracy than in failure. Artists, poets, and preachers tried to turn loss into defiance. The songs that once celebrated Nasser now mourned him. "We were deceived," they sang, "but we will rise again." In Israel, the same struggle for memory took another form. The photographs of victory soldiers at the Western Wall, tanks beside the Suez, flags flying over the Golan filled newspapers and living rooms. But when the initial pride faded, the questions began. Could this tiny nation survive holding lands 3 times its size? Could it control 1 million people who did not want to be ruled? For now, those questions were postponed, hidden beneath celebration, folded neatly like flags put away after a parade. The intelligence services on both sides never rested. The Israeli Mossad expanded its reach, listening to Cairo and Damascus, watching for signs of retaliation. Their analysts spoke of time, how long it would take the Arab armies to recover, how quickly the Soviet Union could resupply them. In Cairo, Egyptian officers swore revenge. They trained in silence, rebuilding divisions from ruins. The generals who had survived the war were haunted by the memory of Israeli planes, appearing like ghosts from the sky. "Next time," one of them said, "we will not wait for dawn." Meanwhile, the diplomats worked to build the illusion of peace. In New York, at the United Nations, negotiations began for a settlement. The chambers smelled of old wood and tobacco. Delegates spoke of ceasefire lines, of withdrawal, of justice, words repeated so often they lost meaning. Each sentence was weighed like ammunition. Withdrawal from occupied territories, but which territories? All, some? The ambiguity was deliberate, and it would last for decades. Far from the marble halls of diplomacy, another front was forming: the war of propaganda. Radio Cairo broadcast stories of atrocities, of resistance fighters rising again in Gaza. Radio Jerusalem answered with tales of miracles, of divine providence. In coffeehouses from Beirut to Baghdad, men argued over which version was true. Truth, as always, became the first casualty of peace. For the people who lived inside the occupied lands, the unseen war was not fought in words, but in rules. Permits, curfews, surveillance, invisible chains that changed lives without drawing blood. A man could be arrested for speaking too loudly. A woman questioned for crossing a street after dark. Fear settled over daily life like dust unseen, constant, suffocating. And yet, even in that atmosphere, connections formed. In Ramallah, an Israeli soldier guarding a school gate began to trade greetings with the Palestinian teacher who passed each morning. At first, they nodded in silence. Then came a few words. Months later, they shared coffee through the fence. Neither spoke of politics. Both knew how fragile the moment was. Sometimes wars end, but they leave behind tiny spaces where humanity tries to grow back. In Cairo, Nasser met with his generals in a dimly lit office. Smoke from his cigarette curled toward the ceiling. The men around him were silent, waiting for orders that would define their redemption. "We lost a war," he said, "but we did not lose the cause." He leaned forward. "We will prepare. We will rebuild. We will make them believe they are safe." It was the beginning of a promise that would become prophecy in 1973. In Israel, Levi Eshkol walked the narrow corridors of his office late at night. The city outside slept, unaware of the burden that came with triumph. On his desk lay reports: new borders to defend, new populations to manage, new dangers to anticipate. He ran his hand over the map, tracing the lines with quiet unease. "We have become what we feared," he murmured, "a nation forever at war." The unseen front was everywhere in the headlines, in the shadows, in the hearts of men who had seen too much and still wanted to believe in peace. But peace was no longer a destination. It had become a mirage visible from a distance, disappearing the closer one came. As the months passed, the Middle East settled into its new rhythm, a fragile calm built on lies everyone pretended to believe. The soldiers returned to barracks. The diplomats returned to conferences. The poets returned to their despair. The war was over, but its reflection shimmered on every wall, every mind, every silence. And somewhere, between the embassies and the ruins, a new generation began to grow up, one that would inherit the world shaped by 6 days of fire and the years of quiet that followed. They would never know a time before the checkpoints, before the maps, before the waiting. For them, the unseen front would not be history. It would be life itself. Chapter 20. The Seeds of the Next War. The years after 1967 unfolded like a long breath, held too long. A silence stretched thin across borders that no longer believed in peace. The world had called it a miracle war, a lightning victory. But miracles have shadows, and in those shadows, the next conflict was already taking shape. In Cairo, the humiliation of defeat was no longer new, but it had not grown easier. The parades were gone, the songs of unity replaced by speeches of resolve. Factories once filled with the noise of pride now echoed with the clang of rebuilding tanks, planes, artillery, the raw iron of revenge. Egyptian engineers worked by lantern light, their hands stained with grease, repairing what the war had shattered. Above them hung a photograph of Nasser, his eyes distant, his posture unbent, watching over them like a ghost. For Egypt, the war had not ended in June. It had merely paused. The Sinai was gone, that endless expanse of desert that once stood as both shield and pride. Now, Israeli soldiers camped where Egyptian patrols had once marched, and every sunrise over the Suez Canal felt like an open wound. Nasser knew he could not win another war, not yet, but he could prepare one. He called it the War of Attrition, a slow, deliberate bleeding of Israel's confidence. The sound of artillery returned to the canal, not in thunder but in heartbeat. One shell, one reminder, one promise. In Israel, victory had hardened into vigilance. The euphoria of 1967 had faded, replaced by a quiet anxiety. The lines they now held were long and thin, too long for comfort, too thin for rest. Young soldiers who had once raced across deserts now stood guard on mountaintops, their rifles pointed at horizons that never slept. The land they had won was vast, but it came with the weight of constant watchfulness. And beneath that watchfulness, arrogance began to grow. The Arabs will not dare attack again, some said. They have learned their lesson. Generals repeated the phrase so often it became a lullaby of denial. But in Cairo and Damascus, men were already planning the next awakening. Nasser's health began to fail. The defeat had aged him, carved lines into his once defiant face. On September 28, 1970, his heart gave out, and the Arab world mourned, as if a continent had died with him. Crowds filled the streets of Cairo, millions moving like a tide of sorrow. Women wept, men shouted prayers, old soldiers saluted the air. The voice that had once promised unity was gone, but in his absence rose a new figure, quieter, more calculating: Anwar Sadat. Sadat was not a man of thunder, he was a man of patience. The world underestimated him. They called him temporary, weak, a placeholder. But beneath his calm exterior burned something that neither the Soviets nor the Americans could see: a determination to reclaim honor, even at the cost of blood. He looked across the Suez and saw Israeli flags fluttering where Egyptian ones had once stood. He saw soldiers sunbathing on the canal's edge, confident, relaxed, believing no army would ever challenge them again. Sadat watched and waited. In Damascus, another leader had risen: Hafez al-Assad, the cold-eyed Air Force officer who had turned his bitterness into resolve. The Golan Heights haunted him. From his office window, he could see the land that had been lost. To him, it was not just territory, it was dignity. "We will climb those heights again," he told his generals. Not for politics, for pride. And so, the two men, Sadat and Assad, began to speak in secret. They spoke not of dreams, but of timing, of how to strike not for conquest, but for restoration. "We do not need to defeat them," Sadat said. "We only need to remind them they can bleed." Meanwhile, across the occupied territories, a different kind of war simmered. In the refugee camps of Gaza and the West Bank, young men trained in secret. Their weapons were few, their anger endless. The names of their lost villages became their rallying cries. Fatah, once scattered, grew into something larger: the Palestinian Liberation Organization, an identity born of exile. For them, revenge was not a plan, it was a way of breathing. The Israelis watched all this from behind new lines, the Bar Lev line, a chain of fortresses along the Suez Canal. They were massive, confident, built to withstand any assault. To the soldiers stationed there, it felt like the edge of the world. Beyond the sand, Egypt simmered. Within the fortifications, they believed themselves untouchable. At night, the canal looked peaceful, its black waters reflecting the stars, its surface broken only by the quiet hum of wind. But beneath that calm flowed an invisible current. Egyptian frogmen slipped into the water, planting mines, measuring currents, testing defenses. Artillery duels flared in the distance, brief flashes of light across the horizon. No one called it war, not yet. But everyone knew it was coming. In Washington and Moscow, the two superpowers circled each other like wary predators. The Americans armed Israel, the Soviets rearmed Egypt and Syria. Every shipment of jets, every shipment of tanks, was another brick in a wall that could not stand forever. The Middle East had become the mirror of the Cold War, a reflection of global tension disguised as local fury. Through the early 1972s, the fragile peace twisted into a ritual of defiance. Egyptian artillery fired across the Suez. Israeli jets answered with precision strikes. For every life lost, another speech was made, another promise of revenge declared. The people on both sides began to live not between wars, but inside one that had forgotten how to end. In the cafes of Tel Aviv, conversations turned uneasy. "It's quiet," people would say, "too quiet." Yet still they believed in their invincibility. Still, they told themselves that no Arab army would ever dare rise again. The intelligence reports the warnings, the troop movements, the whispers from spies were set aside, delayed, ignored. Hubris is a patient enemy. It waits until its host is deaf to reason. And while Israel looked away, Egypt prepared. By 1973, Sadat's plan was ready, a strategy as audacious as the one Israel had used 6 years earlier. The difference was that this time, it would begin on a day no one expected, at an hour chosen not by generals but by God. For now, the desert was quiet. Soldiers on both sides stared across the Suez, separated by a ribbon of water no wider than a memory. They waved sometimes, even shouted greetings. One Israeli soldier wrote home, "We watch them from our towers. They're just boys like us. Maybe if the world left us alone, we could all go home." But the world never leaves such places alone. The seeds of the next war were already buried in the sand, watered by pride, shaded by silence, waiting for the right season to bloom. And when it did, the explosion would come not as surprise, but as prophecy fulfilled. The men who survived 1967 would recognize its shape, immediately the same sky, the same dust, the mystery, same illusion that war ever truly ends. For in the Middle East, peace is not the absence of war. It is only the space between one heartbeat and the next. The war that lasted 6 days has lived for more than half a century. Its guns have long gone silent, its soldiers buried, its generals turned to names in books. But the echoes of that week in June 1967 still move through the deserts, the hills, and the hearts of all who live in its shadow. The borders it drew were lines of sand, redrawn, renamed, disputed, but never erased. Each side calls them by different words: victory, defeat, occupation, liberation. Yet beyond the slogans and the speeches lies something far more human, the quiet truth that everyone lost something they could never reclaim. For Israel, those 6 days became legend, proof of survival, of courage against the odds, of a nation that refused to vanish. The photographs from that time still hang in homes and museums. Soldiers at the Western Wall, flags raised over Sinai, faces wet with tears of belief. But behind every picture of triumph lies the shadow of its cost, the burden of power, the weight of what it means to rule. For the Arab world, the 6-day war became a wound that time refused to close. It tore away not only land, but pride, and with it the fragile dream of unity. The streets of Cairo, Amman, and Damascus still remember the silence that followed those days, when the music stopped, when the crowds went quiet, when hope learned how to hide. And for the Palestinians, it marked the beginning of a new kind of exile, not just from place, but from certainty. A generation born in tents grew old under checkpoints. Their children inherited the same waiting, the same longing, the same endless question: when will home stop being a memory? The 6-day war was not a story of heroes and villains. It was a story of fear and faith, of pride and loss, of nations too young to forgive and too old to forget. A war that began with Jetz's pride, screaming over the desert, ended with whispers at the edge of the holy city, men praying to the same God, asking for different mercies. Even now, the land remembers. The wind that sweeps across Sinai still carries the scent of smoke. The stones of Jerusalem still hold the echo of boots and prayers. And somewhere, beyond the barbed wire and the walls, the olive trees still bloom as they always have, as they always will. History does not sleep. It waits. It breathes. It speaks softly through the generations, reminding us that no victory is eternal and no loss is absolute. The same sun that rose on the first day of the 6-day war still rises over those same borders, casting the same golden light on fields once soaked with blood. And perhaps, in that light, there is still a chance, faint, fragile, but real, that the sons and daughters of those 6 days may one day lay down their fear and finally rest. Because history, no matter how loud its battles, always ends the same way, with silence. And in that silence, if we listen closely enough, we might still hear the lullaby of empires fading, eternal and unfinished. This concludes the Third Arab-Israeli War, the Six-Day War, written for Lullaby of Empires, where history speaks softly and the past breathes again.